All right, everyone, good evening and welcome to the Board of Selectmen meeting for Tuesday, December 18th, 2018. As always, this meeting is being video recorded, and we want to take a moment of appreciation for our troops serving in the Middle East and around the world. Thank you, and welcome to what we hope is the last meeting of the Board of Selectmen for 2018. Certainly the last scheduled meeting. Before we get into our agenda, I just wanted to have a note of thanks for Christine and Mike and the rest of the town administration, police, fire, DPW, who handled our special event in town yesterday beautifully, which came up on short notice, involved the road closure and all of that. And I think it seemed to be a great success. I didn't hear from anybody about it, which is a great indicator that everything seemed to have run pretty smoothly. So thank you very much to you all. All right, so our first appointment is with Town Clerk Carol Mayer to talk about the Town Clerk's office and sharing of duties and resources for the Town Clerk's office and the rest of it. And so, Carol, thank you. Welcome back from vacation. It's good to have you here. I think
multiple copies of
what are you looking for?
Are those multiple copies?
They do look like multiple copies.
I was counting on it being here, so we have to bring it out.
Before you start, I think some of the genesis of that in our discussions here on the board is thinking through generally how we deliver services in town and recognizing the increased financial strain on the taxpayers of Medfield to deliver essentially the same services they've been receiving because of the added cost of employing people, and trying to think about how we can more effectively allocate those resources in all of our departments. And so we've obviously just talked about the town clerk's office and how that fits into the overall situation in town hall in providing services to the town. So I know you put some notes together here, so I'll turn it over to you, and then we can just chat about that a little bit, and then going forward you'll have to talk with Christine and kind of sort this whole thing out.
Okay.
So welcome, and welcome back to Medfield.
Thank you. I hope you all had a chance to look at the little presentation that I did up for you.
Thank you.
It basically highlights everything that a town clerk does. Some of the things in here take no time at all, but some of them do. Mm-hmm. Like census takes from January to probably April to complete. I get bucketfuls to open, process dog licenses. During that time also, I'm getting ready for the town election. Nomination papers, signatures have to be certified, ballots have to be printed, and I'm doing all of this simultaneously. And I basically only have help from seniors that can come in, and they're pretty limited on what they can do. If you want me to elaborate.
Well, I mean that's helpful. I think what we're trying to think about is how do we, as you have the busier times and the slower times, how
Yes,
do we
I do.
get you more help in the busier times, and then kind of have you help other people during the slower times? In other words, because I think as I reading through your presentation, you sort of have two aspects of the town clerk's job as I see it. One is sort of the capital T, capital C town clerk, right? That's the town clerk has to do with elections, kind of those official things. And then you have another piece of it, which is more customer service, right? People come in, they need something, it's sort of sporadic and the rest of it. And so I think we just need to think about, as we need to think about with all of our departments, is how do we best maximize all of the human resources that we have to get it done. Because I know, for example, the state has put a lot of additional requirements on town clerks for early voting and all the rest of it, which are good things to have, but as is typical with the Commonwealth, they don't come with money to help do it. I think we've had volunteers step up to help in that area,
Yes.
But with something as important as elections, you can't be entirely reliant upon people being willing to come forward. So I think, do you have thoughts on that?
My busiest times are usually from January until after town meeting. Then I start wrapping everything up, and the street lists are printed. My less busy times is usually June and July. Starts up again in the fall with the primary, early voting, and the November election. And then after that, I start all over with getting census ready to be printed and mailed. So my downtime is probably June and July.
And so what are of the things that are identified in here, which are the ones that you have to be kind of certified as a town clerk to do? I mean, which are the ones that are easier to train people to help you with versus harder to train people to help you with?
Well, census is fairly easy. Envelopes have to be opened, and each census has to be processed individually. Now, I do have a barcode on them, and the easy ones can just be scanned into the computer, but I would say out of 20, 10 have changes on them. And that gets a little bit more difficult to train a senior to do. So those are the ones that I have to do. Dog licenses are overwhelming at the beginning of the year. We go from January to March, and it's full throttle with that. Elections, not so much involvement with seniors. It's a little bit more technical with the certification of nomination papers, ordering ballots, getting ready for the polls to be set up, testing the ballots, and so forth. It's a little bit more technical.
Carol, I know that in the past, we've tried to figure out ways to make dog licensing work easier, smoother, faster. It sounds like you just said that that's a major problem for you. Is that because there's so much follow-up, because people don't just do it?
That, in February, I also send out and print and send out a second request for the census forms. And anyone that hasn't licensed their dog at that time gets another reminder. But I've still got quite a few dogs that have not been licensed this year rather. So I do my best. Like I said, a lot of things like business certificates don't take that much time. I probably have raffle permits, maybe 10 a year. They don't take much time. A lot of vital requests. We're now computerized with the vitals, so when babies are born or deaths occur, now I get them through the computer. That's not something a senior can handle either. So there are a lot of things that I have to do myself.
Mike?
I heard on the news last week that they're asking the town clerks to come up with a cost estimate on what the early voting costs the towns, because they are going to seek to have the cities and towns reimbursed as a unfunded mandate. Have you been asked to do that?
Yes, but I had no expenses for
You had
early
none?
voting.
Really?
It was all volunteer.
All volunteers?
Yes.
Well, that's something to be said. That's really commendable for all the people that
I
work
want to
the
thank
polls.
everybody that came to me the last minute. I had a full staff, and everything went wonderful.
Good, great.
Gus, any questions?
I think the only thing that comes to mind, I guess there's two parts to the equation. One is when you need help, if you're doing it with volunteers, then that's good as long as you have volunteers. The question that would come up for me is if I thought of your job as the actual technical work that a town clerk needs to do versus what I'll call an administrative aspect of it. If you're beating the volunteers away because there's so many people who want to work with you, my whole comment is irrelevant. But if you're never sure whether you're going to have enough volunteers, then, and Christine, this is probably more something that's going to fall into your court from in terms of leveraging the town staff to also help if it matters, but on the administrative side, so that it's kind of like if something's routine, you're obviously responsible for it. You have to oversee it. You're going to define how it gets done. The question is whether it's absolutely mandatory that you be the one that processes 1,900 dog license forms once somebody knows how to do it, or whether there's flexibility. I think you put the question going in two directions. Is there flexibility to tap town staff if there's a need? Is there flexibility to do that in one direction? And then are there ways that when you don't have your own load, there's ways that you can kind of pay that back going in the other direction? So for me, it's a question of, okay, how much of the town clerk's job is actually dependent upon the technical qualifications of the town clerk, and how much of it is kind of just the sheer administrative mass that has to be processed that a town clerk could oversee someone to do, and what are the what would the greatest needs be, and where would the greatest opportunities be to help that?
Well, I do have seniors that do input and help me with the dog license.
Yeah, as I said, if you are confident in your senior volunteers, then what I'm saying here doesn't matter.
But as far as making changes on the census forms, adding, deleting, changing parties, that's something that I'm really not comfortable having a senior do.
I would understand that. The question is, would you be comfortable having a town employee do some of that if the need is there? And in the broader context, as I'm looking at it, is one of the things that we asked Christine to do in her scope of work is to take a look at how the town operates to see if there's opportunities for us to do things smarter. So I think this whole discussion is all part of that question.
Yes, I would be comfortable.
Okay.
Yeah, 'cause part of that too is I think one of the things we have to think about is we're getting better as a town with putting stuff on the website and getting information to be publicly available. I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, obviously one of the advantages of having an elected town clerk is a measure of independence in terms of board records and things like that. And now it really falls to the town administrator's office and the selectmen to be trying to follow up with boards and committees on minutes and things like that, whereas that really ought to be sort of a town clerk role to make sure that committees are getting their minutes in, make sure those minutes are done. I mean, because it shouldn't be within kind of the administration to do that. I mean, because that's kind of a core function of the clerk's office is making sure that kind of public stuff happens, making sure things get posted on the website and all of that, right? And just like as you do with the ethics compliance and all of those things. And so I think if you're going to do that, right, or you or the future town clerk or somebody else is going to do that, then some of the administrative stuff you're talking about has to be shifted to somebody else, right? And so I think to Gus's point, kind of thinking about with Christine, who that is in town hall and what other responsibilities they have, I think is a discussion for you to have with Christine over the next months, right? So in other words, if we had someone who, for part of their job description was an assistant town clerk and then had other responsibilities as well, and so maybe, you get 30 hours of that person's time in January when there's a lot of stuff going on, and then there's other parts of the year you get almost none of it when there's other stuff going on. And I think that's just something we've got to talk about going forward, because the trajectory of costs is not a good one. And so we can't solve every issue in the town, but as soon as I say we're going to hire more people, that's always what's easiest for any department, is always to say, well, to have another person hired for my department who I control and just does my work. But in the long run, the cost of the town of doing that is probably not sustainable.
Even somebody part-time, no benefits?
Well, I mean, that's a different question, right? I mean, I think still, I'd rather have, I'd rather pay somebody more to do more than to have somebody sort of in just a part-time role doing that. I mean, obviously, that's a budget question. You can submit whatever budget issue, any budget request you want. But I think that's a conversation to have with Christine. For me, I'm not opposed to it. I want to make sure it's run correctly and all of that. At the same time, we got to make sure we're not getting out ahead of ourselves from a spending standpoint. So I do understand that you have a need for additional assistance, and I think the way to do it is kind of what you guys have to figure out technically how that's going to happen. Right. It's really a scheduling issue and all the rest of it.
As I listen to the workflow, Carol, what strikes me is that it really cries out for using the online services of the town website. 4,000 census forms, if those were filled out by the residents themselves, that would certainly make things much easier at the townhouse. And the dog licenses, if people filled those out online, it strikes me that that's the way that this should be going, that we should be asking residents to do this online rather than...
I don't think, Pete, that they could do census online.
There may be legal requirements for something like that, that you have to comply with, I don't know. But it strikes me if it can be done
But
online, it should be.
either way, if dog licenses are done online, I still have to print something out and mail it and record and get the money. So
Yeah, but
it's a
I think
six
it's
and one, half a dozen of the other.
I think it's gonna be a much more efficient process if you're having the dog owners input the material into a digital form, and then you just have to sort it and run the screens on your computer rather than have to actually because I'm thinking that it sounds to me like the breakdown is you've got 2,000 dog licenses to input, and 4,000 census figures that need to get inputted into the systems, and so that if we could have the residents just inputting those themselves, it would save the townhouse a lot of time.
Would they, though?
Would they license their dogs? Not everybody does, apparently.
Are we charging enough for dog licenses? I mean, when you think of the work involved, plus the cost of the animal control officer, the cost of cleaning up grounds from the animal mess, what's the dog license fee?
We pay 10,
$10?
yes. And the committee that I was on, we were working to increase it to either 20 or 25. But when the article went on town meeting, the fees weren't increased at that time.
Carol, do the fees go up if people don't pay right away? I mean, there's a deadline, and if they don't pay by the deadline, does the fee increase then?
Yes,
Yeah.
March 31st, if the dog is not licensed, we add a town mandated $25 late fee.
I know that in the past, we were trying to relieve you and the animal control officer of having to follow up with scofflaws, basically, by somehow making it work so that everybody would comply.
Well, there was a problem with the courts. The courts wouldn't take enforcement action, but I understand they're a little better now? They're
No.
not? No?
No,
So you file a charge in court and the courts dismiss it?
they just don't act on it.
They just don't act, so.
And Jenny Shaw, God bless her, she goes door to door 3 times
Yeah, that's
to
not a
get
good use
people
of
to
her time,
license
so
their
that
dogs.
We need a system that works rather than one that's based on somebody coming to your door.
All right, anything else? Oh, Carol, thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Carol.
To be continued as we go through the season. All right, Nate, citizen comment time. I think this is our second official citizen comment period. So Nate Bazinet to discuss a commercial speed limit property concern. Right, commercial property speed limit concern.
Thank you.
So you need a microphone. You can either go up there or take the in-hand button. Yeah.
Good evening, Nate Bazinet, 30 Oriole Road. I had emailed Pete a few days ago about the topic of speed limit enforcement on private property that's open to the public, most frequently parking lots. I viewed it initially as a pivot from the town's unfortunate recent tangling with the Byzantine state rules on lowering speed limits. After touching base and looking further into what the ultimate goal was, traffic and pedestrian safety, I sent Pete back some further thoughts and a few bylaws it seems other towns have in place here in the Commonwealth. Among the 3 I was able to get my hands on, the bylaws spoke to speed enforcement on private ways, imposition of town signage on any property in town for health and safety, and temporary speed or emergency traffic rules available to a select board. Without going into depth on those bylaw specifics, as the town attorney may speak to the issues and possible difficulties in applying them practically, I'd like to run through a brief list of additional thoughts on how to positively impact the growing traffic and pedestrian presence in town. Employing rumble strips where prudent instead of speed bumps, re-examining railroad crossings without gates for possible addition, identifying locations of concern to place new no turn on red signs, working with merchants to increase safety signage and report unsafe drivers, using carrots to gain buy-in, not simply sticks. Examples of merchants signing on to participate might be allowed a logo on an off-premise sign,
perhaps on coming into town, something that said Medfield Safe Driving Partners, XYZ. And a sign idea, I know that they use the signs at the anti-idling signs at some of the schools. You know, you can say no idling or unsafe driving. Just another carrot example, reduce the commercial tax rate slightly for 1 year to compensate merchants for installing safety signage, and examine the public-private safety grant opportunities that might be available. Another carrot, and this is from Pete's bring back from the MAPC partially, would be to allow for a partner merchant to advertise on the COA shuttle. Separately, allow for merchants to sponsor the COA shuttle for transport of residents to Walpole commuter rail. A stick example would be a merchant cited for a liquor violation would be required or have to install themselves or have the town install it, a traffic safety sign on private property. In the future, where town-owned land is disposed, includes safety, traffic, or green covenants and deeds. Inclement weather, increased enforcement by the police of lights with wipers, going too fast for conditions. And I had a couple of ideas about automated enforcement possibilities. Install a license plate reader at the dump to cross-reference plates to the sticker database, and then mail citations to violators. And then possibly install a traffic camera looking down on 109-27 intersection on town land, like Baxter Park, for red light runners, lefts on red, etc. I'm hopeful that one or even two of these points, alone or in conjunction with additional input, will prove of use to the town. There are certainly a number of pressing issues in town, the 2019 town budget, Dale Street School, 40B, and so on. So I thank the Board of Selectmen for your time this evening.
Thank you. Pete?
So I think, Nate, I think it would be good if you could just sort of explain how this became an issue for you. Sure. Because I think that's sort of informative.
Sure. So like most things, it's something that happens to you. I suppose it kind of is an impetus. Reminds me of the gentleman that had his mailbox hit by a town plow, I think, in the past years. I was at a local merchant and I had parked in a spot I usually don't park in, and I kind of turned around to cross and almost got run over, by somebody kind of rushing to get a light. And, aside from my initial, silent cursing, it kind of gave me the idea about speed limits on the property. And I know that that might be more difficult to enforce depending on some of the rules the state has with the 1/8 of a mile, 1/4 of a mile. It's not as simple as just, doing a radar reading, perhaps, as in other states where I've lived, like Ohio or Louisiana, I guess. But, so yeah, that was pretty much the impetus for my email to you, and then kind of onward to some more, maybe some practical things depending on, that could actually be put in place versus just a bylaw for the sake of a bylaw.
So lots of interesting suggestions that you've put forward. It's a huge list. I'll just share my own personal experience. Last night, going home from a Medfield Foundation meeting, I'm driving up North Street. I need to take a left onto Harding. The oncoming traffic on North Street has a stop sign. The pickup truck blew through the stop sign. I had to slam on my brakes to keep from getting hit head on. I wish that there had been a camera there, and that vehicle had had its picture taken, and that could have been a citation going out to that driver. As it is, that person will have no consequences until, well, who knows why they blew through the stop sign, but they did. Scared the heck out of me. I think it becomes really problematic when you're doing a lot of this on private property, and that was Mark's initial reaction, that we don't really have the authority to regulate on private property, but clearly some of these towns are doing that, and that'd be very interesting to find out how that's working out with them. So,
Gus?
All right. I start off with a predisposition to be averse to having the government exercise more and more control, particularly punitive control over its citizens. So I'm starting from there. Even that intersection on North Street, we've had a discussion about that intersection and the fact that when the lines were repainted, the line has been painted in a way that's setting up a safety hazard. And so far, that was a discussion we had in the summer, and nothing has happened on that because we have a bad line painter. So I'm waiting for a follow-up discussion on that when we have the highway department come in, because I've actually had my neighbor talk about the same thing. That at that particular intersection, because of the way the line works, people follow the line, which sends a signal to people that, oh, I'm going on North Street, I'm not going, I don't know if you did that last night, Pete, but we ought to get our act together in terms of the safety of our own streets before we worry about parking lots. The question I have, though, is how many accidents have we actually had? In terms of what we're trying to address here, the real question is, if this is the answer, what's the question or what's the issue? Have we had a lot of accidents in parking lots, or have people gotten hit because of this? I can appreciate you got out of a car and I take it you were in a parking lot.
Correct,
And
yes.
there was a car that was trying to make a light out of the park.
Correct,
Was this
right,
like
yeah.
CVS or something?
No, it was like at the Shaw's lot, what have you, up on 109. So, you know, the straightaway that goes to the light.
Okay,
Again, and they do seem to have some, I guess, design there where it's kind of harder when you come in, you have to take a right and it's a curb, what have you. So there is some engineering there, but
Yeah.
you know, again, it's just I don't believe there's a no turn on red sign there, and I'll see cars just kind of glide out to the right.
right.
And you know,
Right.
again, and I hear what you're saying definitely about the private property part of it. Again, I think the carrot part probably speaks better to partnership.
My main point was, if we have, like in the case of the West Street and North Meadows Road, if I look at that, I don't think it's a safety hazard, but I know objectively speaking, it's a safety hazard. So the data is there to support that there's something we should do, and I'm on board with doing it. So the only overall reaction I have, if we are gonna look at things, we should be looking at things that really have demonstrated problems, not merely, gee, I wish everybody would go slower around me. I can also see something like a Shaw's, because I think I've seen that same thing. People kind of drift through that intersection because if you don't make it, then the light stays red for a long time trying to get out of there. But large parking lots like that, I can see, actually, your point about the rumble strip, we have them in front of Papagino's, and you know, it slows me down when I'm driving down that. It's a long parking lot, and I don't go very fast on it because there's 2 or 3 bumps that are there. Those are speed bumps, I guess, but I can see rumble strips would be less difficult on the car and would probably accomplish the same thing.
To most point about it being kind of maybe some more legal problems with speed bumps versus like a rumble strip.
Yeah.
I'd imagine that there's less of those, but.
Right. Well, you can make them so small that you're not going to hurt anything. So my general comment is I would feel better about any of these things if I knew that we actually had a demonstrated problem, and then I'd be more inclined, and given your particular experience with Shaw's, if there's particular areas that we have to worry about, then I think we ought to look at it. That one particular thing you talked about, Pete, I would like to see us get the doggone intersection straight first, and then see if we have a problem.
We unfortunately missed an opportunity, because years ago, when I was on the board with, it was very early on in my career as a selectman, Ken Feeney offered to change that intersection. He was gonna redo it, and he offered to change it into a T intersection, and I got defeated 2-1, and it was kept the way it was.
It's the other thing I wondered about in town, when I was growing up, there were no uncontrolled intersections. And I got here, I live up on Harding Street, and you have West Mill that comes out, and the first month I was here, there's no stop sign at the end of West Mill, so it's like, oh, I guess I got the right of way, but you're essentially a T intersection. And then now that I've lived there longer, I realize every once in a while, some out-of-towner comes down West Mill, you see a car approaching that intersection, there's no stop sign. Well, there is now, but there wasn't before. And
Chief Meany's
you know
added-
that- huh?
I think Chief Meany's added a lot of stop signs, like
Well-
at Pine and North, there was
Right.
an accident there, and, because the person coming out of Pine didn't stop, and so he had a stop
Right.
sign there. for
The one
instance.
that caught me was just tonight. And I wouldn't ever try to do this I would treat it like a stop intersection. I never noticed Brook Street when you come out on 109. There's no sign there. And that's the easiest way for me to get to the town hall. So I went that way, and it's like, there's no stop sign here.
Yeah. West Mill had no
My point
stop
behind
signs.
that is that if we have in town, I realize, pushing for stop signs and everything is probably gonna irk some people, but when you have a town where some of the intersections that are legitimate, would you really not stop at the end of Brook Street before pulling out on 109? But when you have certain intersections that are not controlled, people get into a mindset that's, well, this intersection looks like that other one that's not controlled, so I can do a California stop here, and that may be part of what's contributing to the problem. Because I do agree, there's people in the north, that North Street, Harding intersection, you do have people coming like into town from North Street that, for whatever reason, whether it's the stop signs on the wrong side of the road or what it is, but I've had people just roll out in front of me there, and, you know, if you live here, you kind of know that things like that can happen, and it's not a big deal, but.
I was watching him carefully. I had my blinker on. I was thinking, oh, what's gonna happen here?
Well, see, I found when you put your blinker on when you're going left on Harding Street, that gives people just enough time
To think
to
the
know what
thing.
you're doing and then think maybe they can make it. I leave my blinker off there because it slows them down. They
Confuse
have to
them, huh?
really think about it. And by that time, they don't pull out in front of me. It's a strange phenomenon that I've seen at that particular intersection, is if you tell people what you're doing, they're more likely to pull out in front of you. So I don't use my blinker on that particular intersection for that very reason.
So I would suggest, I think I largely agree with the sentiments of both of my colleagues here. I mean, I think we do have a safety committee that looks at these kind of technical issues. So I would reach out to them, because I think it's a question of both practicality and sort of bang for your buck, right? Where are the places where we need to make the most changes, and you can make them without a big investment. So, for example, West Street and North Meadows, that's a big investment. That's kind of a redo of a lot of things. It's not going to be something we can do kind of sort of in the ordinary course. But I think for some of these things in places where it's an issue, and look, it's probably true for Pete and Gus, I would say traffic-related concerns are very high, a high percentage of the communications that I get as a selectman are various kinds of traffic-related concerns. And so I think it is something we kind of have to be continually looking at and figuring out, well, where's the biggest need, and how do we best fix it. And so I would encourage you to reach out to the safety committee and maybe get yourself on the safety committee and start to put some of this kind of stuff together, because I think that's what we need, is sort of people to work it up, right? To work up the proposals, saying, okay, these 3 spots, we're going to try to do it this year, and then next year we'll try to do something else. I would think that would be that'd be a good way to go. Is Chief Wilhelmy, is he?
Chief Wilhelmy
Yeah.
is the chair of the committee now.
Yeah.
Mo Goulet and I believe Christian Donner are on the committee.
Yeah, so I would reach out to them and talk to them, and if you're interested, I won't speak for Peter Gus, but I bet you we could get a 4th member onto the safety committee and
Yeah.
get going on it.
Hey, first off, thanks
Yeah.
for taking the initiative to do this.
Yeah.
Second, for myself, I don't want to convey a cavalier attitude about this. It's that I'm a little sensitive to some of the comments I've had where people want their street 15-mile-an-hour zone closed to through traffic because they don't want anybody in. So, you know, we have to let people get through town as well. So my bias is to make sure that we're addressing real issues as opposed to just a blanket.
You know, obviously, some of it's aspirational, but, you know, for example, like with the, maybe you could save on a detail at the dump by automating
That's a great idea.
by watching by the plates and then just mail it out, and talking about automation with Carol. So, you know, again, very good point about the safety committee too. So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. So, thanks, Nate. All right, now we'll move on to just a small issue, only take a couple of minutes. Medfield State House for redevelopment. You guys have until like 7:45, is that enough time? We're good? We'll cover. All right, well, I appreciate the big printout of all of this. Yeah, this is more help, yeah, this is pretty helpful. So, Ken or Todd, or does someone want to kick this off? Todd? I'd like you to be at the podium, Todd, there you go. Okay. Let everybody see you. So Todd Tremenko is the chairman of our Medfield State Hospital Redevelopment Committee, who has been focused on issuing the RFI to potential developers that the Board of Selectmen voted to issue last summer. So I think Todd is here to present some of the responses to those requests.
Well, that's right, thank you. And I should mention I'm joined here tonight by fellow committee members Johnny Martinez, Ken Richard, and of course, Selectman Gus Murby. And just to maybe give a bit of a overview to be all on the same page, the Medfield State Hospital Development Committee developed a request for information for developers that was issued by the Board of Selectmen on October 5th. And really fundamentally is targeted to solicit responses from private developers as to whether the preferred redevelopment scenario in the master plan is considered buildable by in the development world. As a group, we developed 11 questions. Responses to the RFI were voluntary by developers in the sense that failing to respond to the RFI did not in any way disqualify you from subsequently responding to an RFP or RFQ or some other solicitation that the town might put out. We had a response deadline initially of November 16th. We ended up extending that due to some concerns about whether all of the recipients had successfully received the communication by email. And as a committee, we had initially thought about focusing on a small group of developers who might have a long track record with projects such as the state hospital. But in the end, we decided to cast a broader net and really contact anyone who had previously expressed any interest in development of the property to the town, including prior to the development of the master plan. So it was about 35 or so developers that received the RFI. So the deadline came and we received a total of 6 responses, including one which was probably you would consider more of an expression of interest than a response to the RFI, in that it did not specifically respond to our questions. And that expression of interest primarily related to the recreational development, including the land south of Hospital Road, and really was not overly focused on the core campus part of the property. So as a committee, we've met twice this month to review the responses with the goal of developing recommendations for the Board of Selectmen in this meeting. And at this point in time, we have 3 primary recommendations. And I'd like to go through all of them and then maybe come back and discuss them because they all kind of fit together. The first recommendation is that we work with the responses that we've received. And some or all of the developers who have actually responded. We gave some consideration, even though the response seemed limited, to allowing for more time for groups that didn't respond, or perhaps to widen the net. But ultimately, when we look at the responses, we have several, including 3 that we regard to be from the premier historic rehab developers in the Northeast and maybe the eastern half of the United States. Those developers are all well established. They're locally based in Boston and have clearly stated that the master plan is buildable with potentially some need for adjustment. These firms are all experienced with market rate and affordable housing, multiple populations including senior housing, and they each have their own property management firm. And this would be core business for these firms to redevelop a property such as the state hospital. And just to go into a little more detail, we did put together the matrix that Selectman Marcucci referenced. My copy is much smaller than yours, so if there are questions I may need to look on. But in terms of the 3 firms that really, the response could be summarized as saying that the preferred redevelopment scenario was buildable. First response was from Beacon Communities, which is a company established in 1968. Beacon has developed over 10,000 apartments in 90 communities in 11 states and Washington, D.C. Locally, they, several years ago, acquired Wilkins Glen. They own Highland Glen in Westwood, properties in Mansfield, Easton, other area communities. Their track record includes construction, renovation, and financial restructuring transactions, generally using multiple federal, state, and local funding sources, historic or low-income housing tax credits, public soft debt, as well as private financing. We also received a response from Trinity Financial. It's a firm established in 1987. Their track record stems from sites from Boston to Philadelphia. They've completed nearly 40 complex transactions, including permitting, development, and financing, more than $2 billion in transformative development work, 5,000 units of housing, 285,000 square feet of commercial. Local projects in Metro Boston, Newport, Brockton, Newburyport, among other places. And the third response in this category came from Wynn Companies, which was established in 1971. Wynn owns or manages real estate holdings valued at approximately $14 billion, 120 million square feet under management, including housing, commercial, and retail, 100,000 apartments in more than 550 communities, 22 states, and Washington, D.C., locally in Ashland, Framingham, Boston, and Providence metros. And they've completed 32 historic rehabs with more than 3,100 units of mixed income housing in mixed-use communities valued at over $550 million. The other two responses were from firms that are very experienced development firms who have a different vision for the state hospital property. One is Pulte Group, which is founded in 1950. Pulte is the nation's third largest single-family home builder and is based in Atlanta. They operate in approximately 50 of the leading housing markets in the United States, and locally as Pulte Homes in New England, based in Westborough, Massachusetts. They have experience with state hospital redevelopment projects in North Reading and Westborough, which both involve demolition of all buildings and redevelopment as single-family subdivisions. In the case of North Reading, it's 450 for-sale units that were developed, and in Westborough, it's 700 for-sale units. And then finally, we have the John Flatley Company, which is based in Canton and founded in 1985. This company owns and operates office research and development complexes, retail centers, and apartment communities throughout Massachusetts and New Hampshire. They have a signature mixed-use project in Nashua, New Hampshire, which involved extensive open space, 1.2 million square feet of office, 564 apartments, a hotel, and 50,000 square feet of retail. And they're currently, they've just opened a new apartment building in Quincy, which is approximately 500 units. So in the case of Pulte and John Flatley, it's less clear, in my judgment, and I think the judgment of the committee, that they fully evaluated the vision in the master plan. These developers finance projects privately, and they do not specialize in historic reuse or rehabilitation projects as is called for in the preferred scenario in the master plan. And their vision for the site is consistent, I would say, with their business model, which is generally ground-up development, single-family development, and not renovation. So as a committee, and with help from Sarah Raposa, we did assemble the responses into that matrix, and we've discussed them at some length, which really kind of leads us to our next recommendation. And our next recommendation is that we would like to conduct interviews and do a deep dive with these developers, some or all, but primarily the three that specialize in this type of work, prior to making final recommendations to the Board of Selectmen. We've learned a lot from the responses, and there are significant questions that we think bear on not only our recommendations, but what might eventually be considered at a potential special town meeting. And for example, zoning, how necessary is the zoning? One developer asked about 40R and suggested there were benefits to 40R that were not in place here that could suggest another path or development. We'd like to talk further about infrastructure and how we limit the burden on the town, what the trade-offs might be depending on who pays for infrastructure. We'd like to talk about the real estate tax revenue stream for the town, which is very important in the master plan. Several of these developers have noted that in other similar projects they've received real estate tax abatements, so we'd like to discuss that further, as well as other aspects such as total number of units, whether the 334 units in the plan is a realistic cap. Commercial space development, we have several developers questioning the ability to lease up commercial, or for example, an inn, successfully operate an inn at that location. The percentage of units set aside for affordable housing, and maximizing value, with a disposition of the land versus a ground lease. We've also had some discussion we'd like to explore further with town council whether these meetings would need to be conducted. We're very aware of the open meeting law, but we have concerns with respect to developer interviews about being able to obtain the type of information that we would like in a public meeting context, or potentially even with other competitors, listening in or being part of that conversation. So that's a follow-up item that we would like to pursue. We also would like to accomplish this in January and not create any significant delay in the process that's been contemplated. And then our final recommendation is that the Board of Selectmen discussions with the Art Center advocates should move forward, as all of the developer respondents see the Art Center as very positive for the redevelopment of the hospital. The three respondents focused on implementing the plan are clearly in support, and even Pulte and John Flatley, who have a different concept for that site, did make some exceptions. For example, Pulte's proposal calls for demolishing all buildings apart from Lee Chapel. Flatley's proposal calls for demolishing most buildings, but preserving and integrating several buildings as a cultural center, artist space, or community center. We thought we might receive some responses that expressed concerns about certain buildings being designated for those uses, and deliberately left our questions open in that regard, and we did not receive any feedback or concerns from any of the respondents that that would be a misstep, or that moving forward with the Arts Center was in some way an impediment, or would be perceived as a negative from the development community. And that's certainly something, you know, we can further explore in interviews, but I think the big picture recommendation from our group is that it's seen as very positive, and there's no reason coming from the developer interactions to, you know, to otherwise not move forward, or to be seeking additional information from developers that we think we've basically received and will be reaffirmed in interviews.
Thank you, Todd. Pete?
I was very happy to read through these and to see that people actually thought that the buildings could be reused, at least 3 of these people. Because I had started this whole process before the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee started their work, by having resolved in my mind that the buildings were so far gone that we weren't going to be able to do anything with them. I listened to Steve Nolan at the Master Planning Committee meetings talk about how he had seen projects that he'd been involved with and worked on as an attorney been brought back. He did a lot of, I guess, historic rehabilitation work, and that these buildings were not as bad as some of the ones that he had seen redone. So I got very encouraged by that, and I'm very encouraged to see that 3 of these people would actually redo it. People that have done the Ames Shovel Works project down in Easton, and the things in the city of Lowell. Although I wasn't quite clear whether they had built new in Lowell, or whether they had been the ones that had redone the buildings in Lowell. But
I believe it's redevelopment of the mills. Yeah,
okay, yeah, well, that's then
as
reusing
housing.
the old stuff. I think that your recommendations make a lot of sense. I mean, to me, I would certainly sign on with all of that. And so that, I think that it's, I think you've given us some real good information to go forward with here, and I would encourage you guys to keep working on it and get us more data, more information, more opinions, I guess. I'm very encouraged by this. I think that in general, I guess some of my other takeaways were that the commercial office space just isn't likely to ever fly up there. That it really is going to be a housing development. Some of the people are a little more willing to consider it down or to see if it could work, but it doesn't sound to me like it's likely to work. But again, I was ready to tear all the buildings down 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, I think that I would be happy to have input from my fellow committee members. I think, you know, we were pleased with the quality of several of those responses, and anticipate that those developers would be open to you know, a sit down to further explore some of their comments, as well as some of these larger themes about you know, what are the primary goals, and you know, who's bearing the risk for different aspects of the development.
And the other, I guess, a couple of things that I was struck by as I read it was that we still have this huge albatross of the 25 million or so of infrastructure that we need to build, because there are no streets, there's no utilities, there's no water and sewer, and that creates a big problem for anybody doing a development there. And a lot of these developers seem to think that was the town's responsibility, and so that, and I know that the planning committee had thought about ways of doing that through, I think, TIFs or DIFs or something, as creating a funding mechanism for the infrastructure that would be funded out of the future tax receipts on that part of the town. What was the other? The density issue. I mean, a lot of the people seem to talk about the fact that the density was questionable, that it would obviously be more helpful to them if it was a higher density. And so I think that's the sort of discussion that the town might really want to have, because I think the residents in town really probably, if you get down to the question of how much tax revenue are you going to get out of this, in the long run, are you willing to have more density? Obviously, if you have more density, then the town can get greater tax revenue in the future, and we're looking for tax relief for our citizens, so maybe that's a bargain that the residents in town would want to make. So those were the sort of the major things that jumped out at me from reviewing this.
One thing that I failed to mention, which I should mention, is in terms of further discussions with these developers, we also feel it's important. You know, there are many agreements already in place for this property in terms of how it can be developed, or cost sharing, for example. And you know, that was all included in the plan. And in theory, sure, they read it all before they responded to the RFI. But we'd like to confirm that there's a clear understanding of what the limitations are on the development as we get into these other questions, because it's all of a piece. We've also had some concerns expressed about the availability of water. And we would like to understand better, you know, the town's position on that, and think through prior to these meetings, if possible, how that may bear on discussions with developers for this site.
I think what Todd is saying essentially.
Ken, we need a microphone.
Yeah, just to say what Todd's referring to a little bit concisely is that for the town or a committee of the town to conduct substantive conversations in engaged potential developers to invest even more than they already have, and you know, and I think Todd we all would agree that the solid RFI responses we got took considerable time and effort on the part of the respondents, and before we engage them any further, there's a few like fundamentals we'd like to be able to represent back to the committee, the community of developers, that we have, you know, just, you know, fundamental capacity to execute on a plan that, if a plan would be acceptable to the town, it certainly would have to have the you know, capacity to exercise it.
Yeah, we need the
So-
water and sewer ability to
Right, and
service it.
so what we'd like to say, in a sense, was that we don't necessarily feel that it's a responsibility of our discrete committee to call forth the heads of the various departments, but maybe certainly within the walls of Town Hall and under the town administration, the other stake bearers are brought to the table and get their perspective out there so that we can represent the town more efficiently.
Yeah, and there was an issue with respect to the cost of building out the water and sewer, and I know that Mo was going to talk to Park Engineering, who had been involved with the planning committee, and I don't know if that ever happened and we ever got better results, because I know that the Water and Sewer Board was very concerned about the cost of those numbers, and thought that they could be a lot bigger or something, I think was, but I just don't know if that ever happened, whether or not there was follow-up. So somebody needs to figure out if that happened, because we need an answer as to whether or not we can pull the water out of the ground, and then the cost of the infrastructure improvements that's been ballparked at 25 million, but some people have raised questions about the water and sewer costs maybe being higher, I think.
Well, I think there's two concerns in the water and sewer, right? One is under our DEP permit,
Right.
can we
actually get it?
actually, even if we put the infrastructure in, are we going to be allowed by the Commonwealth to
allowed-
withdraw the
yes.
amount of water you need to serve?
And we need an answer to that.
And I don't think we have it, because I think part of the work that we voted on at the special town meeting in the fall is to help assess what are our numbers really under our current permit, right? I mean, they're gonna have to resolve this unaccounted for water issue to find out if it's just a metering problem, in which case it doesn't give us any more relief. If it's a leak problem, then there's a chance that there's capacity in the system under our permit if it's a leaking issue. And so I think until we answer those questions, we won't know exactly what the number's gonna be. It's likely, I mean, depending on everything else, that you may have to ask DEP for an increase in our permit if you're gonna go in the direction that any of these folks, but that's sort of part two, after we answer the initial technical question of how much water we're allowed to.
And that may be an area where we get our state representatives involved and ask the state government. I mean, we're willing to build housing here. The state wants housing. we don't have the water. If we don't have the water to do it, then we need some relief.
Right, so just to maybe summarize, as we go forward, potentially and speak further with these developers, we'd like to be able to accurately represent the situation or the position of the town, so that as we're talking further with them about infrastructure and other economics of that redevelopment, that's at least disclosed if it is indeed an issue.
Well, I mean, I think it's probably true that if the town votes in favor of one of these plans or one of these approaches, that the town would also be in favor of asking DEP for an increase to the water permit. So I think if the town is supportive of the overall concept, I can't imagine that saying, well, we want to do this redevelopment, but we're unwilling to take the next step of asking for an increase in the DEP permit to make sure there's enough water for it. Now, to me, the first question is, do we want to do what it is that's proposed? And then the second question is, what are the other approvals we're going to need? Because it's obvious from this that, I mean, I would say my overall takeaway from this is that there's very little of a surprise here, right? There are people who want to build up there and who will fund it themselves and will put their own money at risk. And then there are people who are willing to build what the Master Planning Committee has said they'd like to do if they get a lot of public subsidies, right? And none of them put in there what the number is. And so it's obvious that if we're going to do something like what the master plan is, there's going to have to be significant public subsidies. Is that a fair takeaway?
I think that's fair, just, in terms of how the industry operates, generally speaking, any significant historic redevelopment is done through historic tax credits.
Right, but I read the responses to be more than just historic tax credits.
I read it
Right.
as a
Yeah,
town
no, agreed.
subsidy.
Right, I mean, none of them came back and said, we're good with just historic tax credits and we'll fund the infrastructure costs if we can get historic tax credits.
That's accurate.
Right, and so if you're gonna do what those groups want, you're gonna have to have a public subsidy of some kind to
So
make up the
Wynn
difference
talked about a
between.
public subsidy.
Yeah, I think all of them have
Well, but they-
embedded in there.
yeah.
Wynn does specifically,
Yep.
but I think all of them have embedded in there, just like the master plan has this sort of $25 million to-be-found money. And then, the people who want to actually fund it, the development community with capital, has sort of given us precisely what I think we thought the answer would be, right? I mean, I think there's no surprise in what Pulte or Flatley said. I mean, you could have said at the outset that the people who won't need subsidies, this is what they want to do, right? I mean, we've known from the outset of the process, the Master Planning Committee knew it from the outset of the process, that the highest and best economic use of the land is to build dense, single-family housing up there, right? And so we
Right,
have
so-
confirmation of that fact from two people who do that, but that's, from the voice of the development committee, that's what that is.
Right, but we also feel it's significant that if the charter was determined, if the preferred redevelopment scenario, had some legs in the development world, if I can put it that way, the answer is yes, and these are the issues that you face in trying to get there.
Right, yeah, yes, if it's publicly subsidized, right? I mean, in any development, if the government will put money into it, is viable, right? I mean,
Well, you may
depending on
not
how
have
much,
developers of this
depending on how much
caliber
tax
that,
dollars you're gonna
that
put
want
into
to-
it, any
want to own
developer
it,
will build
yeah.
anything if you'll give them tax dollars to do it.
Todd,
Right.
on that
And
point,
so,
I
but-
don't think it's that straightforward. One of the things that surprised me in the comment about tax abatements, the Master Planning Committee had this issue, this $25 million, not that somebody's gonna have to take care of. The master plan had that as a DIF or TIF funding, so it's the district improvement funds was the mechanism. When these developers came back and asked about tax abatements, I don't have any qualifications, so I just looked at it and said, would the town be better off giving tax abatements instead of DIF funds? Where my head was going is that, like DIF funding, the town assumes a certain liability that this thing succeeds, not with the TIF funding, I don't think, but the DIF funding, basically the town is guaranteeing the bond. So if the back end doesn't work out right, the town's left holding the bag. If the TIF funding, the town doesn't get left holding the bag, but it's more expensive to do it. And to me, I read the tax abatement question as, does that mean developers would fund the infrastructure? It's just, it would almost be like having a DIF or a TIF funding without having any liability on the back end of it. If there's if that's an option, then it's not like we haven't already understood that we have to do something to make that piece work. So the fact that they're looking for tax abatement, I don't think is necessarily a more aggressive request than what we had already included in the master planning committee, except we thought there were different forms that would be more palatable, but maybe we're wrong. Maybe tax abatement's less complicated for us, I don't know.
I mean, I would say the other takeaway I had is that, I mean, that I don't think there was any due diligence failure on the part of the master planning committee, in the sense that there's no information that's in this that they didn't consider, they didn't know about. And so I think the suggestion that they hadn't, taken into account the view of the development community is kind of been proven incorrect by these responses, because the view of the development committee, I think, is they knew all of this. I don't think any of this came as a surprise to them, or it came as a surprise to me, or anything else. And so that was another takeaway that I had, is that this was, again, this wasn't really new, right? It wasn't really surprising. It's kind of what you expect the answers to be. And I mean, to Gus's point on the financing, that to me is the real question, right? I mean, if there's got to be some sort of public subsidy, is who is bearing the risk? And the sense is, if you're going to have the public subsidy on the back end, right, and the town is not bearing the risk on the front end, the developer's bearing the risk, right? So you're giving them a tax abatement, they only get a benefit from that if they actually succeed in building it. I mean, I suspect as you push on this more, there's going to be a greater interest from some developers to have the town bear the risk up front. In other words, the math will be, if you invest this money up front, then you will get this net positive tax revenue on the back end, right? I mean, I remember Kathy's chart. It's got, it's like this, like this, like this. Day in 2034, it's, we're killing it, So I think in these interviews that you do, I mean, I think I would be very interested to understand exactly that, in terms of, do they think this is viable enough that they're willing to undertake the risk up front, so that the town is not going to be on the hook for infrastructure that is built for a development that never happens. But in return for that, in the long run, they're going to get a greater upside, because we're not going to collect as much in taxes from the overall project. I think that would certainly address kind of one significant concern with this, which is simply the ability of a town as small as ours, with the government as small as ours, to make this successful. So I think from a process standpoint, I agree entirely. I think your recommendations are correct. I agree with them. One question I had, putting aside the open meeting law issue, and Mark will help sort that out. I mean, do you have examples of other towns or development committees doing these kinds of interviews in other situations?
I don't know.
Innovation
No, I don't know that we've we've been scrambling to review our RFI responses prior to this meeting, so I think that's an area that we should look more closely at.
Mike, what I would tell.
Yeah. It's just for the people at home. It's not.
Yeah,
we can hear you no matter what.
So what I would say, Mike, is the thought process of conducting follow-up interviews came about as a result of actually reading the fairly thoughtful responses that we got. Mm-hmm. And because an RFI response certainly wasn't complete and all-encompassing, we thought it would be prudent upon us to visit with them, ask them follow-up questions, meld their response, weigh their responsibilities, vet them in terms of, how realistic they are, so that we could bring forward a better recommendation for whatever the next steps might be. And, around those conversations too, is trying to get a better fix around the unit count and the density that you brought up, because, that we believe would be one of the linchpin statistics in terms of whether something happens up there or not. And what we're trying to deliver to you is, in a sense, a sense that the preferred plan on the master planning committee's report, how much flexibility do we need to have, both in terms of potential zoning and in terms of potential town acceptance. So if we can get more granular with them on some of those very big dollar items, we can come back with a better assessment to you as to whether it is feasible from both sides of both the town and the development community.
Mm-hmm.
What came through to me very clearly from reading the materials was that it's a trade-off. How much does the town want back in terms of town amenities, recreational, or someone mentioned the cultural arts facility, but the more that the town gets back from things, there needs to be the money to create that, and so that's probably density issues. The other issue that I didn't mention, that I should have mentioned, is that a couple of them pointed to other ways of doing the zoning. One, Beacon said do it as a friendly 40B And Wynn suggested doing it as a 40R, which I thought was interesting. The two of them picked up just different approaches to getting it done.
Right, so we would like to further discuss that in the interviews in part, because we have talked as a committee about if you were to go to special town meeting and the zoning were to be passed, and then you didn't have a successful redevelopment of the site as contemplated, now what, right? Because it wouldn't necessarily, you'd be looking at zoning again, or you'd be looking, I suppose, at 40B. So we want to make sure that in the development community, the zoning has the value that I think was anticipated by the master plan.
One of the things that's always resonated for me was when the woman from Mass Development who redid the Northampton State Hospital came and sat here and talked to the town about that process. She absolutely emphasized the importance of being flexible, that the town really needs to be flexible and don't put in draconian zoning and expect that it's just gonna get followed. You just need to, it's a process basically, that you need to just work through and that's a lot of, I think, of what the Master Planning Committee tried to do of just having guidelines for how things were to look and that sort of thing.
Yes and no, though, right? I mean, it's fairly draconian in terms of where everything has to happen.
And
Sort of
yeah,
dictates the
yeah,
layout of the
yeah,
buildings
yeah.
and declares most of it off limits to development.
The other thing is, there's moving parts. Well, I think it was our last week's meeting, we were talking about 40B, and I think we're now projecting that without the hospital at all, we're on track to have enough 40B units to get us out through the 2030, not the 2020, the 2030 census. So we kind of went into the hospital property assuming a big reason why we wanted it was for 40B. We've now moved ahead in addressing 40B in other parts of town to where now if we chose to have 40B up at the state hospital, it would be because we've chosen to overachieve on the 10% target, at least for the next 10, 15 years. It's not that we're working to meet a pressing need. And at first I was taken back by that, because that's the thing I've been worried about, is that we would go everywhere else to do the things we needed to do and then be left with the state hospital as, gee, what do we want it for? However, the senior housing survey points out that there are a lot of seniors who are looking for housing who do not qualify for 40B. And so suddenly that could change circumstances up at the state hospital around the kind of housing we put up there, in the sense that it could perhaps be a little bit nicer, not over the top nice, but nicer than a 40B project may have dictated that it be. And suddenly you have, more attractive housing that meets the seniors' needs, and that they are qualified for. We get it to a price that they can afford, but without having to kind of go through a strict 40B hoop. So there's a lot of moving parts where you try to put a concept together, and then as that all is happening, you have things like infrastructure and water limits and things like that kind of either are constraints.
In theory, and obviously there's a lot of contingencies on whether we get to the 10% without the hospital, but I mean, there are certainly the potential for that to happen. I think the plenty of 40B projects are nice. They're very nice housing. And the reality is that you would do housing that was just as nice, but the developer could sell all of it for full price. And so in theory, that would mean a lower unit count in total, because you don't have to provide the extra unit count in order to.
But keep in mind, the numerator keeps changing. As you build more houses, the 10% is running on a larger base. So you
Right.
still, just keep that.
Right. That's what he's talking about, 2030. It's sort of projecting out what it will be in the future. And I would assume that whatever we do here, we would do some sort of an inclusionary rule so that it has to be at least 10%, so you wouldn't fall further behind with what happened at the hospital. But there's a lot of profit for the developer in dropping it from 25% affordable to 10% affordable. And so you might decrease the unit count or change the mix of that. Johnny.
It's Johnny. To the contrary, though, too, the affordable housing developers are going to find more financing and higher revenue from developer fees with a higher percentage of affordable housing. So it swings both ways, just so you know, and more revenue from the investors for the tax credit offset might be more to finance infrastructure and whatnot. So I think to your point, yeah, you want to look at all the potential, but just know that the financing could be higher with the higher percentage. So that's where we have to find that balance, which way to move the toggle.
Right. Right. And I think another thing I think I'd like to learn from these interviews is whether, to Pete's point of flexibility, whether if you developed not the whole site, but a smaller portion of the site, but maybe even with a similar unit count, the infrastructure cost would be lower. And it would be sufficiently revenue positive that a number of the buildings wouldn't have to be rehabbed. They could simply be mothballed or taken down as needed. I mean, I think obviously we want to understand what it would actually take to make the plan as drafted viable. But to the extent that the response from these developers would be, we would do it on a different footprint, we would use half the buildings, we'd use some of the buildings, I think that would be very useful to know. How much that would cost, what kind of financing incentives they would need.
One of the comments that was made, which I think we agree with, but don't necessarily see it as a major issue, is the idea of ground lease, probably being less valuable to the town as opposed to disposition because of because of the long-term encumbrance. And I think one of the questions we have is, well, if the zoning is adopted, does that accomplish the purpose that was contemplated by the ground lease? And therefore, could you dispose of the land at a better return for the town because you have the zoning? But if you don't have the zoning, then how do you make sure as a town that you have the long-term control of the site?
Other question, Gus, do you have any?
Hey, I've got a couple of comments. Sure. The first one is the Board of Selectmen strap hanger on this committee. I've been very impressed by all the members of this committee. If you think about it, I think you've had 3 or 4 meetings, I guess. I missed the third one. But the fact that they were able to come together, pull this RFI together, get the RFI out, get the responses and analyze the response, and deliver this in effectively 2 months, and really my observation is that these guys really know what they're doing. And so I would just make that comment, because this has been a very efficient and, as far as I can tell, very effective process up till now. So I appreciate the members of the committee, the chair, for what you're bringing to the town by way of professional insight. Comment on one thing, the recommendation that Todd made around taking the time to talk to the developers, the implication for that, again, based, I think, on our discussion last week, is we would not be looking for a March special town meeting. We'd be looking for a May special town meeting. I think that's wise.
I mean, I think
Okay.
it's an October special town meeting. I don't think it's a May special town
Well,
meeting.
that would be fine. It's not March. So,
It's not March.
Yeah.
And the more, we can talk about it more, but
Okay.
the more I've thought
Okay.
about it, I think just
Okay.
the amount of work we have to do and the resources available in the town to do it, I think
Right.
it's gonna be hard to let the town still make an informed choice.
Okay.
in May.
the-
But anyway,
okay.
we can talk further
The,
about
the
that.
next, there's certain thing, I'll come back to this concept of forks in the road, because there's other forks, but I guess this is maybe directed to the committee, because I didn't walk out of our last meeting with a clear sense that you had arrived at a conclusion yet, and I didn't want to push you to do that. We have a fork in the road with the selectmen being authorized to lease the property for the Arts and Culture Center. We didn't want to choose that fork until we were comfortable that we knew enough of the developers' views to know that we could move, we either should or shouldn't move ahead with that. Based on what you've said here, Todd, I think you're saying the committee is comfortable that we don't have to worry about turning off developers if we move ahead with this lease for the Arts and Culture Center. Is that, again, I'm not trying to push you to that, and I know, and the reason I'm asking is, I see Ken
Why are you looking
smiling
at
over there. It was not a unanimous vote on the first vote at the very least. So the issue is, the Board of Selectmen are authorized to proceed. I'm pretty sure Gene would love to be able to get started on this, and to the extent that this really is a value-adding step from the standpoint of developers, my view is the sooner we start adding that value, the better off. But are we being told that we're at this fork in the road and it is okay to go with that at the point in time the selectmen choose, or are we being told to give you another month for those detailed discussions, or?
Well, I think, there maybe isn't a completely unanimous view on the committee, but I know, and Ken can speak for himself, but has been very vocal in support of an arts center up there, and reviewing the responses and thinking about the discussion at the last meeting. I think effectively that's where we are as a committee. What do you guys say?
Yeah, I was of the opinion that the responses were positive. I don't see any reason why you'd want to hold it up, you know, and I don't know the full details of how it's being financed and everything, but if there is funds coming in for this and it's something that can get done, we didn't see anything negative, and in worst case scenario, you have a refurbished property that's, you know, under lease, and so, you know, regardless of what goes on in the future, that piece of property is done. So I'll let Ken speak.
And as being the maybe the dissenter in the group, my comment had everything to do with, by doing such, by earmarking that specific building for that particular intended use, were we compromising in any way the marketability of the site to the preferred selected developer, and more fundamentally, were we compromising or hindering the amount of tax credit or other kind of subsidy that would be made available to help make the overall project more viable. Two members of our committee, Adam, who's not here, and Johnny, who actually work in the tax credit underwriting business, have said that even if you were to move forward, Gus, as you suggested, that the historic nature and the significant historic nature of that building would still be essentially available to a chosen developer, and it wouldn't compromise the underlying capital. And then based on that reason, then I'm totally willing to withdraw my objection, as long as it's not compromising the viability of the project.
So the concern that I had in that area was the reaction that we had through one of the people that attended a lot of the historic the meetings of the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee, that he'd spoken with Ted Tye at National Development, and Ted Tye said that if he were doing the project, he would want the Arts Cultural Center in a different location in the property, and that he'd want to use the chapel for a different use. And so that, I guess my concern would be whether or not we should wait until we have an actual developer selected before we lease it for the arts cultural use, until we're sure that it's not going to detract from our return on the rest of the property.
So we specifically solicited a response from Ted Tye and National Development as part of this process, and they did not respond.
Yeah.
And, you know, I understand that as, you know, if you ask a developer, you know, what should you do with this building, you might get a different response than build an arts center, but that really wasn't borne out by any of the responses that we did receive.
So if you went with one of these 5 or so, are you saying that then you wouldn't be concerned that?
Could we be clear that this is not a pre-qualification
Right.
for whom I propose?
Right.
This is people who chose, so this is not, you know,
Well,
and we were very
Guidance.
clear.
This is guidance for preparing
Right.
something down the road.
Yeah, and so National Development might be one of the groups that would bid on it when it was actually put out for bid. So I guess that's, you know, it's just, there's that uncertainty in my mind. That's my problem still.
Can I comment on that? That's my next point here anyway. This is a project that has a lot of moving pieces, and the hard part is we're trying to navigate. So we have a master plan, a preferred plan that came from the Master Planning Committee. We have a whole bunch of economic considerations, everything from infrastructure costs to water and sewer, town infrastructure adequacy, to water permitting limits that might affect things, to where we are in the real estate cycle. The one, as much as all of that gets driven around kind of hard-nosed economic, you know, real estate development consideration, there's another dimension to this, which is this property means something to this town. And when I think of the support that the Arts and Culture Center got at the town meeting, and I think of the concept of the Arts and Culture Center not simply restoring a building, you know, a shell that looks like it used to look, but actually bringing a function in there that may not be exactly what has been done in the past, but it's a function that actually brings the town into that building. That's got nothing to do with economics. It has to do with the town's history, the heritage of arts and culture and music. And I think you have to get your head completely out of the nuts and bolts of the economics to think about that, but I think that's something that a good number of people in town value. So it's not that I think that should totally drive the train, but I think it has to be part of that consideration, where if we had just bought a speculative piece of land in Sherborne because we thought it was a good way to flip it and save on taxes or something, we'd be talking about this in a much more mercenary way than I think we actually will wind up talking about it. I talked about fork in the road on the Arts and Culture Center, but one of the other forks in the road, I don't think it's an irreversible fork, and I'll invite the three members of the Master Planning Committee, if my perception doesn't ring it all true, you can just push back, but it strikes me, to Pete's point earlier, when we first started this, when we first bought the property, the discussions were all around, gee, I wonder how many of the buildings we can possibly save, because it might not be very many. And then about a year and a half ago, suddenly the feasibility of saving the buildings, it made it look like, well, most of those buildings could be preserved. Now, for me, what happened is that was a soft fork in the road, because suddenly we went from thinking about how might we use a couple of the buildings that we could preserve to turn this into a development, to, gee, how much of this can we preserve, and then what will we do with it? And I think part of the thing we're wrestling with in thinking this through right now is that the preservation of all the buildings has almost become the starting assumption, complete with all the size, the complexity, the burdens on infrastructure that brings. And I would just say that's how I think we've evolved into thinking about it. That's created some of its own
Not all of us have
problems.
evolved in that
Well,
direction,
okay,
Gus.
well, so that's fine, and that's why I bring it up, because somewhere in here, I'm trying to square the circle between who's gonna cover the infrastructure costs, and if you let a developer come in and put in 600 units, they'll probably absorb the 25 million, but if we do that, we violate the taxpayer. Why are we doing this? Are we doing it because we want the town to have this housing, or is it just, well, we got these buildings, we gotta do something with them, and so this is what we're gonna be? I think this ties into the master planning committee, I think, as well, the townwide master planning. It's like, what do we wanna be when we grow up? And how does this thing support that? And I realize I'm being somewhat sketchy and evasive and incoherent in what I'm saying here, but all these moving parts are all what has to be kind of figured out. We've got committees that are dealing with certain ones. We can't lose sight of that bigger picture.
Right. So I agree with you that the preservation of the buildings became a central focus of the master plan that's been drafted. I think part of our role here, and part of the committee's role, is evaluating whether that should be the focus of what is going to be proposed to a special town meeting, or is it something else? And what we have is, we don't just have these buildings, we've got a liability associated with these buildings. And so we've got a liability associated with taking them down, we've got a liability associated with continuing to own them. And so, for me, if the liability on the buildings were zero, if they could be removed tomorrow at no cost, there would be no reason to redevelop this property. In other words, if we had an insurance policy from the federal government saying, we will insure you against any losses associated with those buildings, and we will take them down when they come, there'd be no reason to redevelop the property. Certainly not to redevelop the whole thing, right? Because for me,
Well, unless there was an economic reason.
yes, unless it's an economic reason. In other words, unless there was gonna be some great economic home run, there was gonna be some great commercial benefit, you could do a very modest, I think if you didn't have that cost, you could do a very modest development centered around the Arts and Culture Center on the, that lower part of the property where the infrastructure costs will be the lowest, where you leave most of the property open. But what we have is we have a liability, right? We have a liability associated with owning these buildings. Some people say it's 25 million, some people say it's 12 million. That number tends to vary based on that person's preference for what happens with the development. And so we still have an unknown cost of what the redevelopment is going to be. And so again, from my point of view, if we didn't have a liability associated with the buildings, there'd be no reason to do almost any of this, right? We could do a little bit of it for senior housing, we could do a little bit around the Arts and Culture Center. There'd be no reason to do a 40-acre redevelopment up there. Unless it were an economic home run,
I think
right?
I agree with you. There are town needs. What I first balked at was the idea that, well, we don't need to develop it. Let's once again buy land and then not develop it. There are needs in town, or there are desires of people in town who would like things.
Right.
So to your point, I think if it had been an empty field, and we had bought it for $3 million, we probably wouldn't have chosen to build 40-some buildings up there. We would have had a much more, modest, lower pressure development. So I think we're in
And
agreement.
I think it would not be focused on, as the plan is, on the site. It would be focused on what the town needs, and what the town can get out of it. Now, the reality is, we do own the buildings. They are a liability, and we have to figure out what to do with them. The Master Planning Committee put forward, a very plausible and nice-looking plan to do that. And that's one route that we could go. And there are other routes we can go. And I think what we're trying to figure out now is what's the best route to propose to a town meeting as to what we should do. And if the best route is some version of the master plan as drafted by the Master Planning Committee, is how does it have to be adjusted to minimize the downside, right? How does it be adjusted to minimize the risk and maximize the benefit to the town? Because, if you look at the list of the benefits to the town of the master plan, there are some there, but they're not, the most of the benefits are you get the buildings rehabbed and at some cost to the public. But to Pete, to your point on the Arts Center, I think that the data we have here, to me, is, because I don't think there's some, projecting out what the winning bid is gonna be, and my goodness, the winning bidder might pay 3% more if we didn't have an Arts Center versus if you have an Arts Center. I mean, it's so speculative that I think there's clearly enough interest, even from what I would call sort of the most hard-headed, market-oriented developers that we have, who even they're saying, you know what, the Arts Center is fine, right? We'd like to build 650 houses around it, but we're happy to have that neighborhood centered around the Arts Center, and all the people in that neighborhood can walk to the Arts Center and go there, right? So that says to me, to Gus's point, given the fact that this is maybe the principal benefit to the town of redevelopment is this Arts Center being in the middle there, I think we ought to go in that direction. In other words, we would focus on developers who want to use it, who see the value of it. And I can't imagine we're costing ourselves any real money, because I think, just my perspective on this, any kind of thing that looks like breaking even over any long period of time on this is a massive grand slam home run, right? I mean, if we break even on this over 25 years, we should have put up bronze and gold statues of everybody who was involved with that, right? I mean, that would be a stunningly successful outcome overall economically over the course of whatever period of time, right? So it's not like we're gonna have some $25 million check rolling in, or net tax revenue of $10 million a year, unless somebody wants to build an 850 unit palace, senior palace up there or something that's gonna be, which no one says no to that either, but.
Could I try?
Or a casino, Bill.
I'll get a player's card right away.
Could I try restating something that you said to see if my
Please do.
restatement?
I don't think I could.
Well, I was sitting there chuckling because what I just heard you say, it was like, gosh, Mike and I are about to switch sides on the discussions we've had before the development committee was formed. Because you had made the argument, I don't want to form a development committee to do another master plan.
I agree.
And so my only.
Development committee at all.
So let me try this and see if this works. The master planning committee put a master plan together. It probably was particularly responsive to the inputs of the public here in town, and not as deep and rigorous in the commercial practicality of putting the thing up in a way that a developer would want, which is why we have a development committee.
I disagree
We're not
with that,
talking,
but-
well, okay, well, you'll maybe disagree with more than I have to say as I restate what I thought you said. The issue here is the development committee kind of knows what we're asking them to do. I don't think we're asking them to develop a new master plan. The development committee bringing that commercial perspective in is likely to uncover issues and concerns from the development side of this equation that will, in fact, this is what we want them to do, that will give us insight into changes we might need to make or might want to make to the master plan that will make it more economically feasible, and it will make it different than the specific details of the master plan as it stands now. In this first pass, there's been no major sledgehammers taken to the master plan, but we haven't really gotten down to brass tacks around what we're going to do here.
Well, two of the respondents took a sledgehammer to it.
Well, yeah, but
Flatly
you know
and
what I
then
learned? Yeah, well,
Nice about it, though.
you know what I.
We're not gonna do it, basically, we're gonna demolish
My
everything.
reaction to that, though, Pete, was I hadn't fully appreciated how important it will be if we have a goal of preserving any of those buildings to deal with a developer who actually understands what how the tax credits work. So I actually started to think, gee, that might have something to do with the criteria. It's not just have you done big projects, it's have you done big projects that involve rehab so that you know how this stuff works. Because I'm sure they're great, it's just that I thought the same thing. The way they did it was, let us take it all down and we'll build up the kind of buildings we build. And it's like, yeah, that would work, but that's not really what we asked for. The thing that I wrestle with is to manage the expectations of the town. So if we do have a zoning change, whether the zoning change that we think we're gonna have now, maybe we get inputs to say that's not the best zoning, but if we're gonna ask the taxpayers to pass zoning, because it seems like having the zoning passed makes it more attractive to developers to actually go after the project, we are gonna represent, they don't have to pass the master plan, that's not up for a vote, but they're gonna have to, we're representing to them what it is we're trying to do when we ask them for the approval of the zoning. The thing we're gonna represent is probably not 100% exactly what we will wind up doing as we negotiate something with a developer. The trick is to be comfortable enough that what we represent is close enough to what we ultimately do, that it's honest. You know, that it's truthful to the extent that we can be truthful and accurate at the same time early in the process. And that's the one thing I think that we in particular need to be mindful of. It's, yes, there may be changes that have to be made, but they have to be, as best as we can do it, we have to represent what this is to the voters in good faith, and then make those changes that this development committee will, uncover hard truths, and and we may run across difficult political constraints that are going to cause us to have to rethink some things.
Well, but, I mean, to that point, I think that's right, but there's some distance between kind of redoing the complete master plan and just kind of coming up with what the best version is of this, or the best way to implement. I think part of, the feedback I'd like from the development committee is, this is what I thought you all ought to be doing other than the RFI, but what is the disposition strategy? What is the approach to doing this? Because it's one thing to say, from my perspective, I think the master plan prepared by the council committee is perfectly fine, right? And if you could do it without any public subsidy, there'd be no problem, right? The problem is the public subsidy. And what is the benefit that you're getting from the public subsidy? So if in our disposition strategy, I could see a proposal to the special town meeting that even though they're not required to pass the master plan, but we still want to get the endorsement of the town meeting for the master plan. You could have endorsement for the master plan. You could have an endorsement for zoning, but your disposition is only going to be a piece of the property. In other words, you have a long-term vision of the master plan. The conclusion is that as things currently stand today, the economics just don't work for the whole thing. Right? The economics don't work to say, we are going today in 2019 decide to embark on trying to redevelop the entire property. We think the economics work for this piece of it. This piece of it, having been redeveloped, will not prevent us from proceeding with the rest of the master plan as the economics change, as potentially interested parties come along, as new ideas come along, as trends change, as business changes, as other things evolve. And so you've done a piece of it, you've got the piece around the Arts Center, you've got that kind of done first. Now again, this is just a possible outcome, right? And then we've endorsed the master plan, so that's still what we want to do, but we're going to kind of look to the future before we do the next step of it, right? And so in other words, we're not rejecting the master plan. We're also not saying we are going to staff up, hire lawyers, commit to a bunch of tax dollars to say we're going to make this master plan work now, beginning in 2019, as opposed to it's a master plan, and this is what we'd like to see there circa 2045, And wouldn't it be great if some company came along in 10 years and said, gee, we're looking for 40 acres and we like this here and we can see our headquarters going in this piece of this property that would fit with the overall.
So I'm gonna ask the committee to weigh in on this, but I'm gonna tell you what I think I just heard you say. We don't need a master developer. The town is gonna be the master developer, and we're gonna piecemeal this thing.
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. You are assuming that this is all or nothing, that we have to redevelop the entire property now, beginning now, and commit to doing that now, or nothing, right?
Well,
I don't know, and it may well be
I'm not
that
making that
that's-
assumption. I'm saying that a master developer, the point of hiring a master developer who may phase it, it's not like it has to be all done in the first year or the first 2 years. The issue is, does a master developer, and I'm taking the advice I've gotten from people that were advising the master planning committee, so I'm not bringing any expertise into this of my own. Do you bring a master developer in to take a look and develop a comprehensive view of how to go about developing the property, however long that takes? Or do you sit there and say, no, we're gonna parcel this out ourselves and we're gonna sell off pieces? Now, yeah, I guess you could create a master developer for the quad and a master developer for the arboretum or something like that, but I'm thinking that if I follow the advice I've heard from people, the practical implication of what you're saying is we're making a decision not to go with a master developer for the property. We're gonna be the master developer for the property over time.
No, I certainly don't think we want to be the
I
master
don't think we do
developer of the
either.
property.
But what I'm saying is, if the upshot of this is that to get to the master plan, it's not worth $25 million of tax dollars to get to the result of the master plan. Bottom line for me. There's just not enough benefit to the town from that. And to take the risk of doing that, I agree entirely, if we're gonna develop the whole property, it should be a single, fee simple disposition to a master developer who will then undertake responsibility for it. The problem I have, and I think the problem is, it's not my problem, it's the factual problem, is that no master developer wants to do that right now. Right, they'll take it, but we gotta give them a steady stream of cash, right? And the way the master planning committee talked about this, we'd have to hire lawyers, we'd have to hire staff, we'd have a significant investment of the town, and even in the comments here from one of them, which I'm trying to find, one of them says the town has to focus on doing, where does it say? There's one of them, the town has to put a lot of time into this,
It's
right?
when, it's when. I
But
think.
a lot of 'em-
Yeah,
a
they've
lot of 'em
really got to
said-
focus on the town should make this project a priority in terms of focus and resources to most effectively advocate for these and other resources from public agencies. That's a heck of a lot of work for a town.
I
for a
think
town
what
very
they were
small.
alluding to was not trying to get too many projects that are going to be getting those same subsidies in at the same time, because then the allocating agencies, they're not going to give the town of Medfield every single project. They're not saying we have to work full-time, day and night on this. They're just saying, don't make Medfield the center of allocations from.
Right. I don't think there's any great risk of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what they were getting at, as opposed to.
Get that one other project.
Yeah, okay, because I read that, because I mean, one of my concerns about this is we don't have it in us as a town to be the master developer of this property. We don't have it in us to be hiring a bunch of people and getting a bunch of staff to try to massage and micromanage this. So I think if we're gonna do the whole thing, and again, my view all along has been we don't need to do the whole thing, but if we're gonna do the whole thing, then it's gotta be to a master developer, and the trick is going to be to make sure that that developer is bearing as much of the risk of the failure of this project as possible, recognizing that economically, it's not enough, it's not good enough for the master developer to bear all of the risks.
So when you say we don't need to do the whole thing, if we didn't do the whole thing, who is managing the thing that we are doing?
The person to whom we sell the land. I mean, when land gets developed in Medfield, nobody manages it. There's a building commissioner,
So
there's people who do
so,
that.
okay, so you're saying if we didn't do a master plan, if we didn't do a master plan with a master developer, we could just sell the land off?
I think we should just sell the land off no matter what we do. Bill?
By the way, I think the committee did a good job. I like the matrix and everything else, but it's not I think in their actions at the moment to put any kinds of interpretations or any emphasis or weight on anything that's in here. But I want to point out a couple of things. Number one, as far as the use of all of the buildings, changing from 10 buildings, which was what the original plan was, let's see if we could mothball 10 and save the rest. The concern that was raised by the consultant was that you would jeopardize the ability to get historic tax credits by taking down some of the buildings. And she couldn't guarantee that you'd be able to get the credits that you would need for the buildings that you wanted to keep. All right, so all of a sudden, the buildings became the focus of everything. And you can see that with what is the value of each of the buildings to a developer, which buildings make money, which buildings are losses. This determined which buildings got the affordable housing, all of the affordable housing units, because that building needed those credits and everything else. So that's how we got from 10 to 30 buildings or 28 buildings, whatever the magic number is. The other thing I wanted to point out was that the master plan touches on phasing, but really doesn't go into any detail of what that is. And as I read the responses back from the developers, there is an element of phasing there, but it's not clear to me whether it's a one-time sale of the entire property and phasing as they do their development, or whether there's an incremental sale along with that. So I mean, I couldn't pull it out. It was contradictory between some of the responses. I would also point out that I've been advocating a two-step approach for quite a while now, and if you look at Pulte's response, and I'm not crazy about what Pulte wanted to build on the core campus, if they took all the buildings down, because the single-family units that they're talking about are not condo duplexes and single whatever. If you look at what they built at North Reading, one of their examples, if you look at what they're building in Westboro, they're 4 or 5 story buildings with, significant number of units in those buildings.
Right, and Beacon had a similar comment about the height.
Right.
I mean, Beacon said that you shouldn't cap it at 3 stories.
But what Pulte did say was they were definitely interested in the Arboretum area. They also said that they're interested in building two condos on the laundry parcel, which unfortunately we are not going to be in any position to discuss for a while, I think, because the cleanup is still going on there.
Pulte did Legacy Farms in Hopkinton, and the Hopkinton selectmen at our last regional selectmen's meeting said that that's a big moneymaker for the town of Hopkinton.
So what you have essentially then is you have 3 developers who are not interested in building new construction on already cleared land, and 1 who is. So, I mean, you have responses here that are at least pointing in a direction of making it possible to develop something at the front and to pursue discussions as to what would that look like at the front. Is the master plan sufficient for that kind of a new development, or is it, the density have to be greater? What kinds of changes need to be made? And you have 3 developers who are interested at the moment in rehabbing and constructing new buildings. So you have in here enough information to evaluate and pursue further, if you wish, a two-pronged approach. So
I just think we don't have the answer to that, right? But I don't think we ought to go into this thinking we have to redevelop the whole property and all of the buildings, and that's the only way to go.
Right, I mean, it's not a turnkey development, right? We're not saying ultimately, as a town, I don't think, go build this and here are the benefits from the town, because what we're getting back in the responses is, well, there's a lot of unknowns, and what about the infrastructure, et cetera? And it's gonna, like any master plan, is gonna have to.
I mean, ultimately, where the rubber hits
adjusted.
the road on this is what is actually in the RFP response, what's actually in the contract that's offered to the town, right? I mean, the problem we have with, and I think, and I misspoke when I said I was not in favor of a development committee. I was not in favor of the RFI process. I was in favor of a development committee doing something else. I think that until we have a developer who makes an offer, an actual offer with a contract with all of these details in it, we're not really gonna know, right? We can get the best information we can get. We can pass whatever zoning we're gonna pass, we're gonna put out whatever RFP we're gonna get, but until we actually see that proposal, even if it's a proposal for a sale, when I say I think we should, for whatever we're gonna develop, we should sell, it's simply a recognition of the fact that the town, we just don't have the capacity to be overseeing a project like this. I mean, if we were gonna try to oversee a project, we'd have to hire several more fairly senior level executive types into town hall. And, if that's the route we're gonna go, that's an added expense to this. I mean, it seems to me, if we are gonna have to provide some sort of a public subsidy, it should be a straight public subsidy It should not be a co-development project where we are holding the hand of the developer and actively involved in this. I mean, I think it's just, we're a town of 12,000 people. We have our government's gotten a little bit bigger, but not a lot bigger. Doesn't need to get that much bigger. And whatever kind of partnership there's going to be, I don't think we can really be a partnership on the development side, other than saying, here's what we want you to do, here are the rules, here's the zoning, here's what's in the RFP, here's in the contract, you gotta abide by that.
And a lot of the people that responded actually made the point that they really just wanted a point person through which their information could be funneled to the
Permitting and
town, and
whatnot.
they sort of downplayed the need that the master planning committee had come up with a special person at the townhouse who would be the real estate developer person, and the need for the law
And
firm.
figuring out the tax credits, the developer's gotta figure out the tax credits, the developer's gotta do the application, we're not doing that.
Mike, you'll have no more vocal alliance on that than me. I mean, there's no way we could, as a town, with town employees, engage in this. I mean, this has to, I couldn't agree with you more.
I think, and just to Todd's point in the recommendations, I think that is our homework assignment, is working with these developers that have responded. And I don't know that their answers are clear cut in that we need full public subsidy of $25 million. I mean, I know, being in this industry and working with some of these developers, I know they find very, very creative ways in developing some very hard to develop properties. They seem to find money from a lot of places. So I think part of this assignment is determining what is realistic and offsetting what would be needed from the town, and that kind of shapes your RFP if that's the route that's gone in. That, okay, we think this is gonna go to the person that can make this work with, this minimum amount coming from the town, because we've talked to these developers and know it can be done. That's pie in the sky. I don't know if that's where we'll get, but I mean, I think that's the homework assignment.
So one of the things that impressed me in going through the materials was, as Ken said, it was very quality responses, and there was a lot of data in the responses. And I would hope that when you go forward with this, that maybe one of the things that you can do is to try to get more data from them and find out, and even from the people that want to tear everything down, and find out what the benefits for the real estate taxes for the town would be if we did it that way. That would be a very interesting thing to be able to present that to the town. Here's the tear down option, and how does that end up for the town real estate tax revenues in the future? I mean, I have a slightly different hope, Mike, than you were expressing. I hope that the town's actually gonna make money on this in the long run through the tax revenues to the town, if we get a real good quality.
I have the same hope, Pete, just not an
Yeah,
expectation.
So, not to move this along faster than you want to go, but we need rules of engagement so that we can undertake this interview process and not run afoul of any open meeting rules or whatever.
Well, your rules of engagement guy is Town Council Mark Sorrell over there. I think in terms of the open meeting law, you've got to work with him. I think any advice you get from us would be suspect, at least certainly any from me.
But I think that I think that we're all indicating that we'd like you to go forward on your plan, certainly, and do the
I
interviews.
agree with your recommendation as well.
And we do think, I think I did comment earlier, that meeting with the respondents who didn't necessarily share the vision and the master plan would be valuable for a variety of reasons. And I do think, just in terms of some of the general discussion we've been having, it probably does lend itself to some type of phasing. I mean, my own view, and others may agree or not, is the developers who are interested in the historic renovation of those buildings, are not single-family condominium builders, and so they'll find the economics in the types of buildings that they develop, as part of their core business. And that's not to say they couldn't build the other types if we required that, but it may be that they're satisfied with that aspect of the project, and that development of other type of housing, which might be ground up, could be done by others in a different phase. And I think, to me, in a way, it kind of comes back to the discussion about the Arts Center, because what I think we're seeing in those responses is it's about placemaking. And if you move forward with that project, I think the development community sees there's something happening here, the town is behind it, the community is behind it, and it becomes more attractive to them to to pursue redevelopment of certain parts of the project. I think that's really what they're telling us.
Mr. Wolf?
Is it appropriate to have a couple of summary comments and a question at this point in time, or do you have some other key issues?
That's fine with me.
Good. First summary
You don't
comment.
work for CNN, do you?
Not
Just
yet.
want to, when you brought up the summary comments, I just want to make sure we're not going to get 5
2
10
comments and a
minutes.
question. I'll take my answer off air. Okay, thank you.
I'm at 1, okay? We've had 3 affirming responses tonight that seem really interesting and supportive of the master plan. We had 2 that were not. You can view that in 2 ways, okay? One way is we had a majority of responses and competent responses that say that the master plan is a decent plan and that there are some things, good things that can be done with it. The other is that it's a 60% win, 60% for, 40% against.
Just to correct you, the overwhelming winner is no response. None of the above. And
Say again, please?
I mean, we sent out 63 of these.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
Right.
so none of the above was
None of
or
the
no
above.
response.
You're right. The overwhelming winner was that.
Well, right, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt.
It
but
was
just,
63 or 36 went out.
36.
36.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. You just transposed something.
Did I
Michael.
apologize?
Okay, all right, good. So I just offer that as a perspective to think about, okay? For me, this is not necessarily a slam dunk, and I think that Todd's point about interviewing Pulte, interviewing Flatley, and others is a really good point, so that we have a great, we have a good balance in terms of the perspectives that we get out of it. The second piece is the water issue. Mike, let me take a slightly different position than you on that. You suggested that we ought to first approve the plan and then kind of really investigate the water issue. My suggestion might be a little bit different than that. Here's what I think I know, okay, but I'm not sure, because at age 80, there are a lot of suspect opinions that I develop, okay? All right. The first piece is that if we do the manganese treatment plant, somewhere 8 to 12 million or so in there, I suspect we are going to have more than enough water supply to do what is needed for the town. So if we look at it in terms of physical capacity, not permitted capacity, I think we can get there.
Well, we have the physical capacity is easily there. It's permanent
Yeah.
capacity is the issue.
Well, let me push back a little
and
bit
the
against that.
infrastructure to-
I think there
Let
are
me put
times in the summer where the physical capacity does become an issue.
100%, not just the summer. If we look at our permit against a year, we've had 3 years out of the past 6. My memory of it is 97% of permitted capacity, 96% of permitted capacity, and 93% of permitted capacity in the last 6 years. So that's very close in total, okay? If you translate that into housing needs, just say that's a 4% average or a 5% average. We got 4,200 housing units, so 5% of 4,200 is 210, okay? And we have in the Affordable Housing Trust, with 3 members present here, we have at least 300 to 400 units that are present in terms of the future for the Affordable Housing Trust. It will bring us to the numbers that Gus just discussed out there. That alone could chew up our permitted capacity if nothing is done. So let me just suggest that, you know, kind of looking at permitted capacity might be a good thing to do. So my suggestion to you, Mike, might be that do you want to get from the Water and Sewer Board or some outside agency a study that says this is what we can do in terms of reduced leakage. This is what the metering problem is, if those are the 2 problems, okay, in it. And can we allow enough capacity to do some of the building that we're talking about here in the town? I personally would view that the water might be our limit here in the town to town building, and that we might want to establish from a town viewpoint what the water limit is first, then make our decisions in and around building. So I just make that as a recommendation to you to think about a little bit.
Well, I think those studies are sort of underway. And I think, I don't think I meant it in
Are
a
they?
sequential state. Yeah, I mean,
You're talking about get permitted as opposed to physical.
permitted.
Physical studies.
Right, but
Well-
the physical studies are underway for the leakage and for the meters. I mean, that.
Some are. I don't know. Is there a full-blown study to determine that? I'm not aware of it. Bill Massaro, are you? You know everything.
It's my understanding that the leakage study is underway, and if you haven't already signed the contract, it's in one of the minutes here or whatever to be signed.
I think we did last time.
So I think you did, yes.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, let's see, I'm trying to remember what I thought having read the statement of work, what I thought the estimated completion was, but I thought it was somewhere like at the middle of the year. So somewhere mid-year for the completion of that. But you don't know what it's going to say. I mean, Mike touched on it at the beginning, Jack. I don't know if you were here, but he said, you know, you might find that it's metering, or you might find that it's leakage, or you might find it. So you don't know. So I don't know what you get out of that. But one of the things I would hope would come up in some of the discussions, if you ever get down to head counts or unit counts or whatever with some of these developers, is you ought to get water usage, their projected water usage pinned down somewhere. I said, if you get, and I don't know when you get to that stage, if you do, because it's significantly a problem with the master plan. You're something at about 120 gallons per person per day.
But I do think, I mean, that is something that is, whether it's a contingency or whether it gets resolved in the RFP process somewhere along the way. I mean, if you're going to issue an RFP for a development along the lines of what the Master Planning Committee proposes, I think there'd have to be an agreement from the town that we'd be willing to seek an increase in our permitted amount, assuming that the result of those studies, which will be completed by the time we have a special town meeting or an RFP being issued or something like that. If the answer is, well, you know what, it's metering, it's not much leakage, and so we really are pretty much at our capacity, I mean, I think that would be something the town would have to do if they wanted to go ahead with it, to say, look, we want to do this plan, there's not enough water under our permit to do it, so we'd have to make a request to increase. I think that's what I was getting at in saying that if the town decides we want to do something and we support that and it requires an increase to our permit, then I think we ought to be willing to seek an increase to our permit. I don't think you can just say, well, we're going to put a water limit on it if the cost to the town, you know, if what's in the best interest of the town is to develop X number of units there for, you know, whatever matrices you're using to evaluate the best interest of the town. I don't think, just like I don't think we ought to privilege preservation of the buildings over everything, we shouldn't privilege what would be not entirely arbitrary, but also not entirely a non-arbitrary limit on water usage if the Commonwealth would be willing to increase the permitted amount.
I have an even stronger view about that. We could get good news from this study that it's leakage, and we are really at 80% capacity, not 97 or 95%. I think if that's not the case, then you can assume that this development will push us over our limits. And if this one doesn't, the next one will.
Yeah, absolutely.
The issue at that point for me is a political issue. If in a time when the state is trying to build 155,000 additional housing units, having Medfield come in and say, I guess we're not gonna have any more growth in this town because we don't have any more water, so just, you know, developers go away, contractors go away, we're just dead in the water. There's a political pressure there that's gonna do one of two things. It's either gonna give us added capacity, or we're going to get hammered to drive our average water usage per capita down. But I'm not sure that we would be able to hammer that down in time. You'd literally have a full stop on development in the town for X number of years.
I have been told anecdotally, Gus, okay, to the second point, that we are somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere between 30 and 50% over our per household allotted capacity, okay? And that this is not viewed well by DEP. And therefore, okay, applying today for a change in our permitted capacity would probably be a no-go. But I don't know that, okay?
Jack, as a
Certainly the
practical
housing
matter, that would
drive is
stop
a
us dead
point.
in the water.
Can you get to your question, because then I want to give Gil a chance.
Done, okay? And the question is this. There's a developer Monte Carlo in the in Chapter 9 of the MSH MPC report. The developer Monte Carlo is central tendency is just slightly negative. It says roughly that developers have a little less than a 50% chance of success. and know that that includes some variant of the 25 million. I think Martha, do you remember the range? Was it 10 million to 30 million for the, that we put in?
That the developer would absorb that?
No, not at all. No, 10 million to 30 million that the town would put in.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that.
That has nothing to do with whether it looks good for the developer, so.
That's correct, yeah, but that's in the Monte Carlo, okay? And the other thing that's not in the Monte Carlo is any monies for the Arts and Cultural Center in any way, shape, or form, okay, in that. So what you have is a 50% chance of developer success. Was that considered and noted in any of the developer responses in any way?
No, so when we, as part of developing the RFI, we discussed and then ultimately decided to not share the math behind the master plan.
You did not.
We did not. We separately had a meeting with Mr. Casey, who took us through the model, which was very helpful, and shared the model with us so that we could spend some time, seeing the changes that would result from changes in variables. But I think, our view generally is these developers are going to have their own models. They may not bear any resemblance to, the assumptions of the consultant that put the plan together. They may only relate to a piece of the project and not the overall project. And so we felt it would be premature at the RFI stage to try to get into the mathematical assumptions in the master plan.
Would you consider sharing any of that in the question and answer period, or at least alluding to it, or asking them about their financial assumptions?
Well, I think that's where, we'll discuss it, but my view would be we'd want to talk to them about, how much of this project are they really interested in and how would they approach it. For example, just in my own individual view, building by building is not the way that these developers are likely to look at it. But likely to look at it as multiple sites, one project, one set of investors for historic credits, maybe another set, and it'll be, that's what they do. That's how they assemble these larger projects.
Well,
Two comments, one question.
I'm going to go to Gil. Johnny, I'm just going to go to Gil next, yeah. Thank you.
I'm Gil Rogers and one of the members of the Master Planning Committee. And there's maybe 3 points I'd like to make. First of all, I think that in terms of infrastructure, what's extremely important for the town to consider is the balance between growth and more housing units and all the types of infrastructure, not just water, not just sewer, but transportation, road systems. Because I think what's happening is the town is emphasizing more housing when the highway system, when the transportation system is fixed. And as a result, you're getting very serious congestion. You talked a little minute ago about North Street and Harding, and that's becoming a very, very dangerous intersection. I've had a number of incidents where I nearly got hit. Somebody came through it. And I live on North Street, and I see what the traffic is now in the morning, starting at about 5 minutes before 7, and at night. And it's just a stream of traffic. So when we're thinking about units and adding more units, I think the town has to now consider if it has a sufficient infrastructure to support it, because all it's going to do is make the town more and more congested. That's point one. Point two is I did a number of catalyst meetings we had a small catalyst meeting group. And one of the things that we're very seriously warned about was spending time with specific companies. We met with probably 3 or 4 developers that were experts in taking historic buildings and renovating them. And we were very concerned about meeting and spending special time with those particular companies, because it gives them an unfair advantage or the appearance of an unfair advantage. So in meeting with developers, as you're talking about here, I think we have to be very careful if that's going to give the appearance of favoritism and that somebody's going to come back and say, we weren't involved in that. So it's not just the open meeting law, it's also the perception of competition, and if we're being fair about competition. And my third point is on this issue about having a master developer or a central developer versus not. We did a a sort of pro and con analysis of that that's included in the notes. And we didn't, I mean, I think the committee started to come to the conclusion that, as you guys have said, that the town itself just doesn't have the staff or the capability to try to manage a very, billion-dollar project like this. Doesn't have the expertise. You'd have to staff it up, so that we were moving more to the point that you need to have a central developer or a master developer that would coordinate the whole plan. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't get built, or it would just, end up in just a prolonged process, then conflicts and all. So those are my 3 points that I think it's the balance between growth and infrastructure. Secondly, the problem of having the expertise to actually manage a project like this that we don't think that the town has. And the third is a point about fairness and competition. And if you can really spend time in a few select companies without having other companies complaining about it.
Thank you, Gil. Those are good points. John, you want to go next, or?
Just one quick comment, because Gil, your point's well taken, particularly with regard to the unfairness in the marketplace. So I don't know whether you had a chance to read it, but the RFI itself had a very clear legend on it with regard that it was informational only, non-binding, and that it did not provide any kind of a advantage to actually respond or not respond if and when the town should ever move forward. So your point's well taken, and fortunately the town gave us that advice.
Thank you.
I was just going to say really quick on the sharing of financials. In the RFI process, like he just said, there's no benefit to them at this point providing information. They're not getting the job based off of that. So how much time or effort did we expect a developer to put into that? And I think getting them bogged down in the master plans model, let them go with their own pen to paper how they were going to do it. I don't think there was any point to get mired down in sharing the financials with them. I don't think they were going to spend any time on it anyway.
And if I could comment as well, I think there's some value in them doing it independently, because it validates or invalidates what might have been determined based on the assumptions that were built off of the model. Because they were assumptions with some broad plus or minus potential. They had pretty good bands of uncertainty around it because it was so speculative. So I do think there's value in letting them independently look.
So I'd like to wrap this up if we can, unless anyone else has a parting comment. Todd and all, do you all feel that you have kind of enough direction and input and have gotten out of this meeting what you were hoping to get by coming?
Yeah, so we'll do our follow-up with town council and figure out what's appropriate to move forward.
I can meet with a couple of you tonight if you want to just quickly.
I do have one question, just in light of Gil's comments. When we talk about master developer, I don't know that we ever seriously talked about the town being a master developer. So the staffing that the town would have to be a master developer is, to me, never been on the table. The question, or I think the advice I heard earlier, was that the town should hire a project manager and a designated attorney, at least on a part-time basis. I didn't view that as being the master developer for the project, but rather being the qualified representative of the town working with a master developer. I just want to understand the comments that were made here tonight. Are you basically saying, and including you, Mike, no, we just hire the master developer, dispose of the property, and we really don't need to do anything on the town side to make sure the town's interests are protected? Or is that staffing requirement of a project manager and at least a part-time attorney the model that we should be thinking about, even if we do go with a master developer?
Is that a question for us?
Well, anybody that has an opinion that knows more about this stuff than I do. I'm going partly to you guys, but I'm also, Mike, you had made the comment we don't need it, and Gil, you made the comment that we don't have the staff, and I know that. But I'm trying to understand what we're actually saying about what the town should have by way of staff brought on board for this project.
I think we're going to need to hear from our new town administrator in January as to what she wants for the town to oversee this. I mean, it's a huge undertaking to oversee
I
this.
would
I know
hope
that,
that our hope that our new town administrator would look for advice when we're talking about a $300 to $500 million project, that
Yeah.
it might be a good idea to get
so
advice.
I can
on
tell you from watching Tom DeWitt, who was the president at LaSalle College, when he was interested in building a project, I mean, he built LaSalle Village, basically, which is like a 200-unit CCRC, just because he didn't find being a college president interesting enough, I think. And so that he did that. I saw my job is to keep him at LaSalle by allowing him to build this project that made it more interesting for him. And he basically did that on his own. You know, he had Choate Hall and Stewart helping him on the side when he had legal issues, but I don't think, I mean, and LaSalle College certainly has a decent staff of people. You've got a CFO and a bunch of different things like that to call on, but, you know, it was basically Tom DeWitt, I think.
So you're saying we shouldn't need to hire anybody?
I don't know, you know, it's up to,
Yeah, I mean, I think
it depends on the personalities.
I'm probably one for two,
skills.
Gus, in that I have an opinion. I don't know that I know more than you, but I'll weigh in on the
I'm
opinion.
just trying
piece
to
of it,
figure
you
out
know.
how I should be thinking
I mean,
about this
I
going
think the way
forward.
I think about it is, I mean, you're obviously gonna need professional assistance in the RFP process. You're gonna need professional assistance for a lawyer to negotiate the contracts, whatever commitments the town is making. So upfront, no matter what we do, there's an upfront basis. On an ongoing basis, we should shy away from projects that would require us to hire somebody specifically for this. Now, if the answer is we need to hire a second building commissioner, right? Because our one building commissioner won't be able to keep up with the work. That, to me, I mean, that's a normal regulatory function of the town. It's one that we already do. And so, for example, with the project they're doing in Millis, I think our new building commissioner was saying, you know, he had an office at the project, right? So he would come in and he'd sit there and he'd be there. And so it may well be that in order to enforce the regulatory aspects of the project, we're gonna need to hire somebody additional. I would be reluctant to think we're gonna hire somebody who is kind of a quasi-real estate professional to be kind of shadowing or working with the developer on what are really real estate issues. And so so maybe it's a project manager, but I wouldn't even wanna have the level of involvement in the project that we would have in like a public building project. Like where you'd have a project manager for a public building project, you know, I don't know that we'd want to have that much contact in that much responsibility there. I mean, again, look, if the answer is the only way you're going to manage this is to have one person, then you have to do it, you have to do it. But to me, it's unattractive to have a project that we have to manage continuously. And it may well be unattractive for a developer too. The developer wants some certainty, right? The developer wants to get a contract. Here are the rules. Here's what I get to do. I don't have to renegotiate this with politicians every 6 months, right?
I'm not arguing for a position. My point isn't to manage the project. My point is, what do we need to do to make sure the interests of the town
Yeah.
are represented properly in a project of this magnitude?
Right.
Well, I mean, I think that our town administration basically is full out managing the town to begin with, so that if we're gonna add something like this, I think that we need to think about the fact that we're gonna have to give them some help.
Well, we can sort that out another day, so.
Yep.
All right, well, thank you. The next thing we'll take up is the special legislation. Town Council Mark Sorrell has prepared special legislation document regarding leasing the Lee Chapel and the infirmary building to the Cultural Alliance of Medfield for the purpose of developing arts and cultural center. Mark.
Very, very simple, basically two components to it. One is, gives you the authority to, lease up to 99 years. It's a gray area, but you have that authority without special legislation. And the second is to make it, give you the authority, as long as we're doing that anyway, giving you the authority to negotiate or enter into a lease directly with the Cultural Alliance of Medfield rather than having to go through a 30B16 disposition process.
And so is it, I guess, I know you've discussed this with Gene, is it Gene, it's your intention that the Cultural Alliance itself will be the entity that is the leaseholder or the owner of the building? It won't be a separate?
This is a nonprofit, this Cultural Alliance of Medfield, Inc. It's
No,
not the.
I understand, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I mean, I thought this was straightforward, and we're hoping to do Development Committee, last chance on this one. You guys are all okay with this? All right, so I think, do we need a motion of some kind, Mark, or just an indication that go ahead and,
Motion to, transmit it to your legislators to file on your behalf pursuant to a town meeting action.
okay?
I move that we forward the recommended wording from town council in regard to authorizing through special legislation authorizing the Board of Selectmen to negotiate a 99-year lease for purpose of the Arts and Culture Center, and that legislation furthermore specifies that we are authorized to negotiate that lease with the Cultural and Arts, Medfield Culture. Cultural Arts of Medfield, yeah.
Cultural Alliance of Medfield.
Cultural Alliance of Medfield. It's acronyms, you forget what the words are.
All in favor?
Yep.
All right, so I think that covers our hospital-related stuff for our agenda
Well,
tonight.
last week we talked about two parts of that. One was the special legislation. This was in the conversations with Senator Feeney and Representatives Dooley and Garlick, who were also interested in advancing a budget allocation, or at least starting the process and asking the question. So we wanted to, they were also interested in advancing that on January 2nd as well, although it won't be heard until later in the spring. They wanted to get in the queue for that, so they were interested in your feedback on that tonight as well.
I think we approved it last time.
Yeah, I thought we had responded favorably to getting money.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't know if you needed to do anything more formal than that.
I don't think so, right? I don't think so.
Okay.
I think
Is
we're
there
all-
something you want us to do that's more formal than that? I think what we did last time was we basically said, sure, because if we didn't go down that path, they can always pull the earmark.
Right.
Now it looks like we're going down the path, so they wouldn't pull the earmark. But is there something?
No, I think that's enough.
Okay.
Yeah, a letter might be helpful for them.
Okay. Can we ask the town administrator or assistant town administrator to prepare a letter on behalf of the selectmen to?
Whereas.
Some whereases.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Sarah, Town Planner Sarah Poser requests that we vote to authorize me to sign a 40B technical assistance agreement regarding Medfield Green, the project at the corner of Dale Street and 27. Any questions on this one? We have a motion.
I move that we authorize Chairman Marcucci to sign a 40B technical assistance agreement regarding Medfield Green.
Second?
All in favor?
Yep.
Director of Public Works, Maurice Goulet, has requested us to vote to authorize me to sign amendment to the existing contract for the town's consultant, Weston and Sampson, to extend services as the acting chief operator at the wastewater treatment plant. Town Council, Mark Sorrell, amended the agreement by adding, except as expressly modified by this amendment number 1, all provisions of the original agreement between the town of Medfield and Weston and Sampson services shall remain in full force and effect.
So I have a question. And maybe Mike or Christine will know, because Mo's not here. When we signed this, the last contract for this, as I recall, we were signing for someone to be hired to do this as the town was looking to hire someone to run the wastewater treatment plant. This is a 3-year extension, which suggests to me that we're having a shift in strategy on how we're staffing the plant.
We're struggling with finding somebody to come in as a town employee to run the plant.
So with a 3-year contract, we're effectively giving up on that for the time being.
For the time being.
Okay.
We're working with DEP on what the next move will be on that.
That's the only question I have.
All right. We have a motion?
I move that we authorize Chairman Marcucci to sign an amendment to the existing contract for the town's consultant, Weston and Sampson, to extend services as the acting chief operator at the wastewater treatment plant, as provided in the document that for the next 3 years.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
All right. And we are requested to vote to approve the following 2019 common Vittler licenses. Medfield Donuts, 270 Main Street and 563 Main Street, Medfield Griddle Cafe, Town Talk Mediterranean, Italian Groceria, Donut Express, Medfield Subway, Royal Pizza, Starbucks, Blue Moon, Papagino's, Casabella Pizza, Cutlets, China Sky, and Grow Fresh.
So Medfield Donuts must be the real name of Dunkin' Donuts then.
That's probably true.
I move, are we ready? We ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
No, that's Donut Express. This is Dunkin' Donuts. It is? It's owned, they're franchises, so they're owned by a franchisee.
It's the one that's
And
in
there
the,
are two of
the
them,
one that's
so-
in the gas station. The one that's in the gas station, yeah. Both, yeah, yeah. Ready?
We ready?
We're ready.
Okay, I move that we approve the following 2019 common vittler licenses: Medfield Donuts at both 270 Main Street and 563 Main Street, Medfield Griddle Cafe, Town Talk Mediterranean, Italian Groceria, Donut Express, Medfield Subway, Royal Pizza, Starbucks, Blue Moon, Papagino's, Casabella Pizza, Cutlets, China Sky, and Go Fresh.
Second?
All in favor?
Yep.
Aye.
Our Youth Outreach Director, Dawn Alcott, requests us to vote to authorize me to sign the payment voucher input form regarding the earmark contract to provide public awareness and education on suicide prevention.
I have a question. You're signing, I'm gonna find where I had it. The form itself is a signature certifying the receipt of those services. For what he's, on the form, but it's for future work.
It's for consulting services.
So, but why are we certifying that we've received them before the contract starts?
The state requires that you, in order to get reimbursed, you
Yep.
have to sign them. We signed a contract with Interface we pay that contract up front with them to provide the services for the year.
You see what I'm saying?
I do.
You're the one signing it.
This is funded from the 30,000 that was included in the state budget, yeah.
I'm not questioning both the contractor or the contract or the price of the contract. What I'm getting at is the certification says we have received this. So it's effectively a false certification or or a blank check. I'm not worried about them performing. It's just that I'm looking at the form saying this is a certification saying the work has been done when in fact it hasn't even started. So I gather
The wonders
this
of
is another
state-
example of a state bureaucracy that just wants a signature on a piece of paper without actually caring what this piece of paper says, so.
Keep the paper flowing.
I love when I get to take the minutes.
I got it here some, so,
I'm trying to find it because
Yeah,
I read it and I don't think I read it.
I would just point out that it's interesting, it was interesting to me that the funding for this had been done in the past by the schools and the police, I think, and that, so we're changing it over to the youth outreach.
Well, I think that was always the intention when they asked for the $30,000, because the police department originally asked for the $30,000, that this is what it would go for.
Yeah, so this is the one you're talking about, the
it's
vendor
right there.
certification.
Yeah, it's like stupid.
Yeah, see, I guess I read it to mean because we got the contract, but I see
Yeah,
what you're
I
saying.
happened to read what the word said.
Yeah,
It's
no,
like,
I
wait a
read it
minute.
and I said, okay, it's, yeah, because it's
There you go.
11/8/1/18 to 10/31/19.
So you're signing a blank check for a good purpose with a reputable company for a reasonably small amount of money.
Right.
I move that we authorize Chairman Marcucci to sign the form.
Now I'm not so sure I want to.
I was going to say, when you put it that way.
I figured my duty was to simply inform the chairman of the
I
board of
think
selectmen
rather than
what he's been
authorize,
asked
you'd
to
better
do.
change your motion, Gus, to mandate him to sign it.
Man, I know, I might not want to do this now.
I-
because-
I read that state contract you signed one day. I read it closely, and if you read some of the things, you're subscribing to observe all kinds of federal laws and mandates, and which probably go on for hundreds of pages, and if you read them, you would never
Contracts.
sign them.
The basic problem was a point that you alluded to a few moments ago, which is the state does not distinguish with their form contracts between dealing with another government subdivision like a municipality and a private vendor. They use exactly the same form, and to go back to something you raised earlier, a whole lot of it doesn't apply.
Right.
So, Mike, years ago, when I was on the 350th Anniversary Committee, I was tasked to read the town's insurance policy, and I was actually horrified by some of the things that I found in there. It struck me that that if you were a town employee, you were named insured, and named insureds were not covered by acts of other named insureds, I think. It was kind of that was the thing that struck me as sort of a glaring error.
The insured versus insured exception.
It's a good thing we get along so well on this board.
A standard insurance, the I versus I exception, yeah.
It's changing every year. In fact, one of the things that they added to the policy this year is cybersecurity insurance, which has become a big thing. Every year there's some new little feature. We used to get public officials, school officials, and law enforcement liability for free, and now there are so many lawsuits coming down in those categories. We pay something like $30,000 for the three of them. So when people see these lawsuits coming down, they say, well, it's an insurance company, it doesn't cost me anything. Oh, yes, it does. When you get those premiums, you're paying for it through the nose.
All right. Happy to talk again, Mike. Thank you.
Yes.
Getting us in that holiday spirit, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, discussion items. I don't think we need to discuss anything in the budget tonight. I think we have that for February 8th. Pending Fire Chief
Did
Karen.
we pass, or
We didn't vote on the last one.
Oh.
you're not gonna
Sneak
sign
by
it?
that. We're all spooked on this
I
thing.
I moved, what that thing I moved, you just have to second that. Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
No.
We actually are doing quite well on getting the budgets in this year compared to other years. We've got a lot of budgets already in, so, yeah.
So I think we're going to talk about that on February 8th. We don't have nothing on the budget to talk tonight. Fire Chief Carrico requests us to vote to accept the Hazardous Materials Emergency Preparedness Grant provided by MEMA, vote to authorize me to sign the standard contract form, and vote to designate Christine Truweiler as the authorized signatory name. I think this was the contract, Gus,
It
the
was,
last time
yes,
around,
I,
did not have the
appreciate the
authorized
correction.
signatory.
It was missing my name off it, and I should have
I-
realized that last week that I was the one who was authorized.
Well, shame on you.
Yeah. That's the money, I think is that the one we appropriated money at town meeting, but when we got the state
No,
grant?
this was a grant that Chief Carrico applied for MEMA to do some hazardous materials training.
Oh, okay.
Separate from that.
So I move that we vote to accept the Hazardous Materials Emergency Preparedness Grant provided by MEMA and authorize Chairman Marcucci to sign the standard contract form designating Christine Truweiler as the authorized signatory name.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, Townwide Master Planning Committee Charter and Appointment of Members.
So I had an action to update the charter,
Yes, you
and I did, but I was doing it at the last minute, so I didn't email it to you.
It's okay.
What I did was I took the changes that I proposed from last week and simply accepted them. So if you want those changes, you have to go back to the early one, and I can get them to you. And Christine, I'll send you a copy. And I did, can you guys share that, and I'll give you one of these copies. What I did here, and you probably still want to read it and see if you like what I worded. If you recall from the wrong document that I updated from your original bulleted thoughts, Mike, I had added a bunch of stuff. Basically, I had the action last time to incorporate those things into what was already here. So the formatting was not particularly cooperative, so don't hang up on the formatting, but everything in red is what I've added in. I was doing it this afternoon, so undoubtedly it's a little bit too wordy. But you can at least look at it, and maybe we can react to the, either you like it, don't like it, or you want to change it further. And I will send I'll send electronic versions out to all of you, so you can have the electronic copy. I just didn't get a chance to do it before I came. And the most important things, just to highlight the changes, mostly I was incorporating my questions into things that were already here. The most important changes under residential development, I also asked for plans to look at 40B community housing and senior, non-subsidized senior family housing as a piece of that, not just simply tax positive development. And then under town land, this gets more editorial, so I don't know whether you guys agree with it or not. But I asked to also take a comprehensive look at open space and identify actions the town can take to ensure ongoing action. What was behind that for me was when we were looking at the Redgate Farm purchase, which connected to the Scout land. I didn't know that Scout land was there. But in the course of taking a look at the Redgate property, which allowed us to get access to that Scout land, I went to take a look at the official access that we had to the Scout land before we owned Redgate, which is a path up on the border of the Walpole line, which is completely overgrown and for all intents and purposes makes it inaccessible. So if we're gonna have open space and we have access paths to open space, we ought to have provisions for how we're gonna maintain those access paths so that people can use the open space. Otherwise, we got too much open space because we don't bother to maintain it. We ought to.
Yeah,
get it
that
back.
particular piece of land has a history to it. The town had negotiated to buy that lot right on the Walpole line.
Yep.
And a resident got up at town meeting and said it was a waste of money. That land would never perk. There could never be a house built on it. A year later, there was a house built on it. And that 3-foot access easement was negotiated with the owner that we were proposing to buy the lot from. And the owners of that house did everything they could to discourage people from using that.
That's what
3 foot.
people do. You know, they have a public access, but what they do is they
Yes.
let it be overgrown so
Yeah.
that effectively I have the walkway right next to me and I mow it because it's like I'd just soon have people use it, but that's not
Yeah.
typically what happens.
No.
Usually typically what happens is you let that get overgrown and it's back to being your private property again.
We've had sort of similar problems with up on off Pine Street. There are easements that from that subdivision into the 40 acres of land that was given to the town, and the neighbors try to discourage people from using it. In fact, we had a call from someone that wanted to put a fence across the easement, said you can't do it.
Right.
So,
And what happens is over time, things get physically so broken up that then it becomes apparent, it doesn't even become apparent there is any.
Right.
And it's, I think if we want the access, if we want the open space, we should maintain it, is what I'm saying. So that's why that's in there.
We should have a good map and good markings of it too. I mean, there's a public walkway off of Jade Walk.
Yep.
But it basically walks through people's side yards, and it's very uncomfortable to do it. I mean, unless there was a nice marker at the curb that says, this is where the town town path is.
Right.
And then you'd feel better about it.
It seems like there's some great Eagle Scout projects in the mix for some of those.
The other thing is, I just noticed that when I did the bullets on, later on, it changed some numbers. So on that page that has the resident, 1, 2, 3, 4, the 2 bullets, improved options for travel within town, that should have been number 5, and town infrastructure should have been number 6. They, Word changed those on me. The bullets that follow that, though, were actual real questions. So anyway, you may not like what I wrote.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. This makes sense to me. I mean, I think they're all, what I would suggest is, to the extent, Pete, you have additional questions you would put in the bullets or other kind of points there, I'll think about that, and maybe we can finally get a final set of those next time.
In any event, I'll send this out to you
Yeah,
electronically.
but I don't see anything, I'm supportive of everything that you have in there. Pete, do you have any reaction to what his edits?
Yeah, nothing strikes me right off the bat.
Okay, so why don't you and I will think about it, if we have anything
Put it
else.
on the agenda for the
Put it on the
8th.
agenda for the 8th, and we'll try to get any further comments you or I have, Pete, into the materials in advance, and then finalize that. What about appointments to this committee? I know we don't have a full slate. Do we want to make some appointments to the committee, or do we want to think about that and do that on the 8th as well? I mean, obviously, nothing's going to happen meeting-wise between now and the 8th, so there's not any great urgency to appoint. So would you rather defer to the 8th?
I'd defer, yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, we'll defer to the 8th.
Yep.
But I think we're
Yeah,
close
can I
enough
make
on
one
the
other
charter
point on
that for
this,
people
too?
who are interested,
The,
we can share this with folks.
I forgot, the other thing is the table that we had at the end of the appendix. I
Yeah.
cut out some of the more directive
Yeah.
items, so again, if you don't like, it kind of follows up on the conversation we had as well.
Yeah, no, I thought those were fine changes as well.
okay.
No, it's-
should we send a letter out to the boards asking them for their appointments?
We did.
Yeah,
It's
we've got some.
all gone, yeah.
We've got most of them, I think.
Yep. I think Evelyn's chasing down a few more, but.
Okay, good. All right, well, that's good. Progress there. Of course, now I put the agenda away. Licenses and permits consent calendar. I have to say, it puts a smile on my face to see that we will be approving some licenses and permits for Zulo Gallery first Thursdays in May and June. So we can look forward to some warm May and June afternoons, evenings, out on the deck. We'll be returning the corner. Any objections to anything on the license and permit consent calendar?
None at all.
Do we have a motion?
I move that we approve the requests on the consent calendar.
All in favor?
Yep.
I did have a request for a license that came in at 6 o'clock tonight, and Palumbo Liquors is requesting the Board of Selectmen allow them to open at 10 a.m. this Sunday, December 23rd, and close at their normal time of 6 p.m.
Can we, I think we had this issue before, can we give a blanket approval to all the liquor stores in town if they're gonna do that?
Oh, this was before the holiday, this was pre-holiday.
Yeah, we
I
did this
remember that.
last year too.
Yep.
I think we had a similar situation.
Because they could legally be open earlier, now the law changed, but
Yeah.
they've chosen to have their licenses
Yeah.
still generally open at noon time.
But I find that this is a last minute request, because none of it on the
Yeah.
agenda.
Yeah.
And in fairness to all, we'll consider it for any of the other liquor store is holding the same license that Palumbo has, they can open at 10 a.m.
If the license says they will open earlier, are they required to open early?
Technical,
No,
not
that'd
with
be
a, not with a package store.
Not with a package, I think with restaurants, or
Well,
there's
that's
some
right, because
stores
they
that are.
require, restaurants are required to provide sustenance for travelers, so they have an obligation to be open during their hours. They're coming from a different legal,
And alcohol is not a substance.
only for our.
It is a debatable point, Mike.
Right. All right. Do we have a motion?
Or it used to be, at least. I move that we approve blanket approval for all the liquor stores in town to open up at 10 a.m. on Sunday, this coming Sunday, and with closing time at normal hours.
Second.
Now, we
All in
often get
favor?
requests for New Year's Eve to stay open later for restaurants and establishments. I don't know whether,
I mean, we haven't gotten them. I mean,
are we meeting now? Do we have any more meetings
No,
before?
we're not meeting until January 8th.
So I don't know whether if we get any requests in, how you want to handle
What are
that.
the standard restaurant hours?
Usually they close at 10 or 11 o'clock,
Boone
and
Hill's
they
open at
like to
12.
stay open till 1 o'clock
or
on
1,
New Year's
yeah.
Eve.
I'd go with what we actually get asked to do. Mike, you
Yeah.
just have to plan ahead.
if we get any complaints because the police are shutting them down at 11:01, we'll,
It's always at 11 o'clock someplace. Huh?
yeah. All right, town
Want to vote
administrator.
on it? We didn't vote, we only moved and
Vote on the
seconded.
liquor store, I didn't even vote on the liquor store thing.
I
did
think
we?
we had a
No,
motion, I
Mike
don't think I
brought it.
had
Oh,
a.
do we have a second on the liquor store thing,
We
Pete?
did have them.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, all right.
Don't want to leave any confusion about that point on Sunday morning.
I'll be making sure at 9:58 they're still closed. I'll be checking them all out. Town administrator update.
Yeah, I had jotted down, I'd asked you people to think about how you want to use the remaining funds in the 15,000 meals tax money. Because we're not certain, I don't think we've got all the bills in on the holiday stroll. So we probably need to get the balance of what's available. But I jotted down a few things that you might want to consider funding. The Dwight Derby House is sadly in need of a lot of work. The Garden Club, I think you gave them about $2,600 last year, and I think they did a remarkable job
And
with
they
that
put a
money.
formal request in last week.
We did, okay. Or did they specify an amount?
They did not, just wanted to
Okay.
be in consideration.
But I think that's well worth, they did some innovative things this year, and the holiday stroll, I don't know whether they're gonna need more money than you allocated for them, but we'll get that, when we get all the bills in, we can figure that one out. Tree planting, but I think you managed to get donations for the trees.
We may need, some money for the post office ones, we're not.
For the post office, okay, yeah. Although you may be able to get donations on that. Usually there are people that, if it's in a very public place, they're willing to donate. And then Meeting House Park Grounds, I think that always can use some sprucing up. I think it gets pretty badly beaten, especially during Medfield days, so whether rototilling or something like that, whether that I can check with Mo and see if there's any, or Park and Rec, and see if there's anything that they would recommend funding. I don't know if there's any other projects you could think of that might be a good source of use, good use for those funds, but let me know and we'll get a balance on what's available for left in that after we get all the bills in.
Great.
The pocket park's looking okay, Gene?
It was a remarkable success once again, even though the weather was a bit colder, so. Yeah. Thank
All
goodness there
right,
were plenty of places to warm up.
I think the draft of the 2019 annual town meeting article can wait for 2019. unless we
Yes,
want to talk about them.
I think I sent you all a list of articles, so if you could go over those, any you don't want in there that I've got on the list, let me know. Town council's been going over them and making some changes. Anything that I've left out that you want to add in. What I'm trying to do before I leave is draft a warrant so that you'll have some idea of exactly what's going to be in there. It looks like there's quite a few articles this year just from, you know, for example, the traffic control, local traffic control, there's 2 articles there. Zoning, there's a few zoning changes.
As far as those traffic controls, nothing's changed from the concerns that were raised at the fall town meeting. Unfortunately, Mass DOT is, unless and until the legislature addresses the issue,
Okay.
there's nothing to be accomplished there.
Okay.
Is there likely to be anything accomplished before the Springtown meeting? No?
Not at all.
Okay.
All right.
We have had an offer of a donation of 1.4 acres of land from a family that has owned it for 40 years and decided they're not coming back from Nevada.
Down Indian Hill.
So, and then there's Mo has a couple of articles in potentially to fund the reconstruction of the West Street Bridge. I think we ought to talk to our representatives about that when I see all the work going on in the towns around us funded by the state, and they're gonna make Medfield and Millis pay to repair the bridge. I think that's a disgrace. Park and Rec project, I assume they will be coming in with some sort of recommendation for, they're not ready?
They're not gonna be ready, no.
Oh, yeah. I did ask the schools whether they'd be ready to come in with additional funding or a bond authorization for the Dale Street, and they said, no, not next year. It'll be at least a year away, so.
We just got the feasibility study approval this week.
They did get approval to go ahead with the phase 2, yeah, but I think that's gonna take a year,
That takes a while.
yeah.
All right.
Water and sewer articles, I'm not sure exactly what they are proposing, but I just put a placeholder in there for that. Mark did have an article, he would like to amend the water and sewer regs to regulate fire hydrants, to prevent people from putting objects around fire hydrants or plantings or whatever, so.
Well, water and sewer put it into their regs, and I, reading it, thought it was more appropriate to be, as a town bylaw, it implicates public safety more so than water and sewer issues.
Do we have people doing that?
They did a cut and paste from regs from other towns, and so this is one thing they came up with. It's a valid concern, I mean.
I've never seen a fire hydrant that's been messed with in Medfield, so.
It's more like.
That's because you can't see it with all the plantings.
What do we do about God that puts all that snow around the fire hydrants? Or Mother Nature or
Walpole,
whatever.
They paint their
so,
fire
yes.
hydrants like policemen and things like that.
There is, article, Mo also has an article in there to appropriate funds to repair what I call Richie's Pond, which most people call Danielson's Pond. But they're trying to find a way to allow the highway department to do that, which would be much cheaper than having it done
We have
by
like
an
a
outside
consent, we have a
contractor.
consent agreement or something, or isn't there, we don't have a choice about doing that, right?
No, but there's a choice about, the consultant we hired to evaluate the pond is trying to get it downgraded because he doesn't feel that it meets the standards for a hazardous dam. We never thought it was a hazardous dam until the state sent us a letter saying it's a hazardous dam, but, and our consultant doesn't think it meets quality. And if we can get it downgraded, our highway department, which has built bridges all over town, culverts, they could do a lot of the work and save a lot of money. So, there's also
There's the dog ordinance, which will get people to come.
Yeah, the what?
The dog ordinance that'll get people to come to the town meeting.
We essentially passed most of that last year. I'd really scrutinize anything further, because by default, because of what I felt we needed to get passed, I pretty much took most of what they were looking at. Now, if they wanna tweak some fees and things like that, there's absolutely room for that.
By the way, I did hear last week from the point person for Verizon on the State Hospital water tower, and they have applied to the Zoning Board of Appeals for a special permit. They also need, there's one other permission they need, I think, from the Selectmen or Water and Sewer Board to go ahead with the project, but it's their intention to move quickly now to put the cell phone antennas on the Mount Nebo water tower.
It's a water and sewer contract, right?
On the State Hospital water tower, yeah. Town council tells me that we also need to put an article in authorizing the town to.
Reauthorize every 10 years on the Mount.
On the Mount Nebo. You can only lease for up to 10 years, so.
You could lease longer, but that happens to be the authority that was granted in the first place.
And John Thompson suggested that he and Mark had drafted something last year about dog control.
That's what we were just talking about a minute.
Yeah, oh, okay. So he said he'd have that ready.
Great. Mike? Selectmen action list, we can talk about that next time. Selectmen report, Pete.
4 things. First, the Medfield Coalition for Suicide Prevention had a meeting last week and heard from a high school, former high school student, Sophie Griffin, who gave a very eloquent account of what she went through and her issues with the school administration. It'll be interesting because Jeff Morrison had to leave early, and I'm sure that he's going to let us know why the school administration didn't follow up on Sophie's suggestions. Went to the Massachusetts Association of Planning, APA, whatever that stands for, it's planners. The APA honored the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee and also Steve Nolan as the Citizen Planner of the Year. And it was kind of fun to hang out with planners for a while, and very nice accolades for both the Master Planning Committee and for Steve. Medfield Foundation met last night, and the Medfield Volunteer Awards are going to open up in January for nominations. And then I got interviewed last night by the Medfield High School papers reporter about 40 Bs. So I'm looking forward to my article about 40 Bs and what Peterson knew or didn't know.
Yes.
You know, I thought I had a negative report, but I also got interviewed by a high school reporter, but it was about the special town meeting article for the Arts and Culture Center. So apparently you're the low-income guy and I'm the arts and culture guy.
Did you get?
I'm not worth being talked to at all.
You're the master negotiator.
Go between guy.
I don't know. It's a.
I don't either. I spent time in Wilmington, Delaware last week and have nothing to report on what's going on in Wilmington, Delaware. I did make it through. I don't think I have anything else, but I noted at the outset, thanks everybody in the town for making Monday run so smoothly. That was great.
The DPW and the police department were incredible in making that happen so quickly.
Yeah, I think that was.
I do want to say that it took me a long time to get out of my street that morning.
You didn't get out early enough.
But
It was a non-stop.
You were trying to go see the stars. You were trying to go the other way. You're supposed to go.
No,
You're
just
supposed to
trying
follow
make a
the
right
detour
turn,
signs.
Incidentally, in case you get any questions, this morning the town hall lost its power and was on generator, and it was a very peculiar reason. The wind last night blew the Christmas lights off the tree, and they landed on the pole just before Starbucks and shorted it out.
We blew a transformer.
Oh, wow.
So there were 2 Eversource trucks that had to come, and it also shut down the elevator, so we had to get the elevator repairman out, so it was quite a day, so.
Oh, wow.
Better check your insurance policy.
And so that tree no longer has Christmas lights, operable Christmas lights on it, so. Holiday lights, yes. No, the national holiday
No.
is still called Christmas.
This is town property, the holiday lights.
We are subject to federal law, and the federal law The holiday is called Christmas. Yeah, when Congress wants to change it, well, then we'll call it holiday, we'll call it a holiday.
On that note, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year.
Happy
Hanukkah is
Kwanzaa.
over, but Happy Hanukkah to all who are
Kwanzaa,
celebrating.
Kwanzaa.
Kwanzaa, happy, whatever you are celebrating, happy to all of you. We will see you all in 2019, January 8th. Thank you. We have a motion to adjourn?
Just the last meeting of the, I just want to savor the moment. Closing the book on
2018.
another year of Medfield history. I move that we adjourn.
Yes.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, aye. I think the TV's off
Aye.
already.